My name is Taylor Bester. I'm the current president of Bluffland Whitetails Association. I want to thank everyone for coming. Everyone that here is obviously passionate about deer in our area and concerned about CWD. I'm going to keep it short so we can get this going. I think Ryan's going to start with a PowerPoint, but I'm going to turn it over to Nick. He'll introduce himself and then we'll get going. Thanks for coming.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a Saturday during deer season, which I know is a tall order, but we appreciate you being here. My name is Nick Pinizzotto. I'm the president and CEO of an organization called the National Deer Alliance. So if you haven't heard of us yet, we're not totally brand new. We've been around for about 3.5 years now, and we are focused 100% on policy, deer policy. So it's not the fun on the ground stuff, which everyone likes to do most of the time. It's the stuff like in DC where I was last week, dealing with issues like chronic wasting disease, which I would say I spend 80% of my time working on CWD as an example. We are, I'm sure you've heard of Whitetails Unlimited, Quality Deer Management Association, and Mule Deer Foundation. So we serve as an umbrella to those organizations focused on policy. So we don't do the banquet thing or anything like that like they do. We focus on the policies so that they can do their on-the-ground conservation work. So we're a little bit different that way. We're small and we're agile, and again, focused on policies. So I find myself doing these types of things as well. I would say this is probably at least a half dozen different CWD forums that I've been asked to moderate this year at different places in the country. And although I hate talking about this disease, because like many of you, I wish it would just go away, we'd have to deal with it. I don't think any of us got into working with deer with the idea that we work on this disease issue. We want to do the fun stuff. However, I'm always happy to do it as well, because it's important that we get good information out there, factual information, because it's challenging, right? There's so much information that we would rather believe because it suits our desires. Like again, if someone could walk up here and say, CWD is not real and I can prove it, I would give that person a big giant hug, right? Because that's what we all want. But the reality is not that. And the reality is also, we have to admit that there's a lot that we know less about the disease than what we do know. Okay, so we have to admit that as well. It's very complicated and it's not simple. So I think our goal here tonight is we've got a really great group of panelists put together, and it'll be my pleasure really to moderate this and get the information out of these folks. So we want to take advantage of their time being here. We're going to start off with a couple of presentations. Bryan Richards is going to start us off tonight and give us a real good primer, a real good background on the disease. So we're very lucky to have him here for sure. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll get things rolling. And then Doug Duren, then we'll also have some slides for you. And then at that point, we will all go up here to the front of the stage here as the panel and start going through some more information. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sit down. I'm going to turn it over to Bryan and have him kick us off. Thanks.
Now you tell me whether that worked. We're on? You can hear from above. Either that or my voice got really loud all of a sudden. So, good evening, and I echo, thank you so much for coming out. Would have been a nice day to be out deer hunting, but that wind is just a little on the harsh side. You're hanging in a tree, at least for my preference anyway. So we're here to talk about CWD tonight, so I thought I'd start out with talking about a different disease, bovine tuberculosis. Why be focused on CWD solely, right? So bovine TB is a bacterial illness, quite different than chronic wasting disease. A hallmark of this disease is respiratory function. Your lungs basically fill up. You're not able to breathe and respire appropriately. When bovine TB becomes established in livestock, there's severe agricultural consequences, economical consequences. You'll have export limitations put on either a portion of your state or your entire state. So this disease also has the capability of spilling over into deer periodically, and it can also infect humans. This is not the primary TB in humans, but bovine TB can spill over. So the transmission mechanism is well worked out with bovine TB. It's respiratory secretions. So it's a lung disease, and so you're spewing up material, literally spewing up material. So one of the primary mechanisms is aerosol. So if you sneeze, there's infectious material in that. Also, then you think about if an animal this stuff is coming out the front end, nose-to-nose contact can result in disease transmission as well. Likely, in addition, we can have ingestion of contaminated food. I'm talking about feeding and baiting right there. So if deer A, sheds, infectious material on a foodstuff, and another deer comes and consumes that, it can result in disease transmission. We didn't used to believe that bovine TB could persist in free-ranging deer herds, and it only has in 2, as far as we know at this point in time. But the ability to persist in free-ranging wildlife herds is likely due, in part, a function of deer density, and also our human practices of aggregating deer closer together, think feeding and baiting stations like that. So there have been 2 5-county area virtually every year since. Primary tools that Michigan DNR has employed to manage TB in white-tailed deer is promoting hunting, lowering deer density, and trying to impact the number of artificial aggregations through baiting and feeding, reductions or bans in that area. But they have not been able to eliminate disease. So it's been out there for a long period of time. The last 5 years, I should preface that, almost every year we saw a minor decline in prevalence. So it looked like the use of these 2 tools, keeping hunters active, reducing deer densities, and restricting the amount of feeding and baiting going on, was really having an impact. Prevalence was declining. About 5 years ago, prevalence started increasing again. Okay? And as of this year, had the highest prevalence that they've measured in this area. And the DNR is kind of concerned. Identify that if this persists, they're afraid that geographic spread of this disease will likely occur. And this one on the bottom, hunter numbers, effort continue to decline. Control measures in addition to hunter harvest may be necessary to maintain or reduce prevalence. So they found disease. It exists, it's endemic out in the white-tailed deer population in that portion of the state right now. And the approach they took was fairly minimal, trying to utilize just minor increases in hunting, promoting hunting to keep deer populations down, and baiting and feeding restrictions. And at least at the current time, it was largely effective, but now the effectiveness of that is in question. Let's contrast that with the other known case of bovine TB in white-tailed deer in North America. That was right here in the state of Minnesota. It was picked up the first time in 2005, up in the northwestern part of the state. I think Minnesota DNR and the stakeholders in the state of Minnesota took a look at the situation in Michigan and decided we didn't want to be like them. We didn't want to be like them. There was a great deal of concern over the loss of economic restrictions being put on the agricultural sector. And in essence, Minnesota DNR, with the support, large degree of support from the legislature and the governor's office, took the gloves off. They implemented some very serious measures. Shooting from a helicopter. They took the gloves off, okay? Pretty serious techniques. And that was supported all the way through your state government because how serious bovine TB could be to the agricultural economy of the state of Minnesota. They then kicked in a tremendous disease monitoring and surveillance program. Well, guess what? It worked. It worked. The last TB positive deer in that area was found in the fall of 2009, and the state regained their TB-free accreditation 2 years later. Same disease, same situation, spilled over into free-ranging wildlife. A different approach and a different outcome. What about chronic wasting disease? Let's go to New York just for a minute. This is kind of an interesting story. CWD was picked up in 2005 in 2 deer farms. They were about 10 miles apart, something like that. So the state of New York implemented a very rigorous program to try and detect disease, to see whether it had in fact spilled out of those facilities. They found 2 positives in wild white-tailed deer 7 miles away from one of the positive deer farms, and they were within half a mile of one another. In the pursuing 12 years, they have never found another positive. So what it looks like here is that disease likely leaked out of one of those facilities, but it had not established itself on the ground. So it's kind of like taking a match and throwing it into a pile of leaves. Sometimes it's going to light a fire, sometimes it's not. So the state of New York, by going out and implementing that very rigorous protocol to try and determine whether disease had leaked out of that facility, they found it, but disease had not established. It did not persist. And today, New York is CWD free, as far as anyone knows. Pretty similar situation. I put up here, round 1 of CWD in Minnesota. Kind of the same situation, very similar, at a deer farm, just a few miles from here, or elk farm that was CWD positive, and then implemented some very rigorous surveillance to try and find out if in fact CWD had leaked out of that fence. I don't think there's any conclusion how it got out, but they found CWD in a single doe. She was about 9 years old, something like that. Old doe. Found that single doe, did a tremendous amount of surveillance, liberalized hunting seasons in that area, never found another one until more recently. Okay? So again, it looks like disease somehow maybe leaked out of that facility and did not become established. So that's one possible outcome. We have 2 possible outcomes with TB, depending on the degree of rigorousness of the management intervention. And now we see one possible outcome here with regard to CWD. Take a look at Illinois. Illinois discovered CWD in 2002, right after that state that starts with a W, just to your east, where I'm from, where after they picked up CWD, Illinois picked it up down here. So Illinois implemented a pretty interesting program. Number 1, they greatly liberalized hunting opportunities, tried to get hunters to take as many deer out of this core area as they could. Then they implemented sharpshooting, government sharpshooting. After deer season is done, in this environment, they can utilize aerial platforms, helicopters or fixed wing, to identify where pockets of deer are. Then they can get access. They try and work with landowners to gain access to those properties, and they conduct sharpshooting, government sharpshooting, to try and take out pockets of deer. They've had mixed results, I would say, in the state of Illinois. In this core area, they have held disease prevalence, prevalence being the proportion of animals in that population that are positive for CWD. They've been able to hold prevalence in that core area at a fairly low level. That's different than some other places. Now, the state of Illinois had limited resources to apply to the problem. They only had so many people. And so disease has certainly, it's escaped captivity. It's escaped confinement. So is it a success story? It's not a complete success story, but at least we learned something from their efforts up here that appropriately applied intensive harvest techniques seem to have the capability to hold prevalence in check. So kind of a mixed bag with regard to an outcome. How about Alberta? Alberta is an interesting study. CWD was first detected. This is the boundary. This is Alberta over here. This is Saskatchewan. This number of positives here, I think that was in 2008 that I made this map. Alberta saw CWD taking off in Saskatchewan, and they decided to implement very, very rigorous management response. So the idea started with intensive agency culling following extended hunting opportunities. So they used sharpshooters on the ground in an effort to try and literally drive CWD back out of Alberta into Saskatchewan and create a buffer zone. Right? In 2007 and 2008, they started doing government sharpshooting from an aerial platform called helicopter. Incredibly effective for killing deer. If your goal is to kill deer, you can take upwards of 200 a day. So from a disease management, a population management standpoint, this showed every bit of promise of working. where it failed was in gaining support. Without stakeholder support, without support of landowners, outfitters, and hunters, the program failed. The funding for their program was taken away from them by the government because stakeholders did not support it. So let's look at the outcome. At that point in time, there was a couple cases here. CWD has marched progressively in all three directions in Alberta. And over here is a graph showing prevalence. Disease responded incredibly well to the lack of management in that environment. So there's another outcome. So there's all these different possible outcomes with regard to CWD. And so as we get going here tonight, this is the situation that, according to the DNR that we're in the state of Minnesota, you've got some deer farms that have gone positive. And so the DNR is conducting surveillance to try and see whether CWD has in fact leaked out of those facilities into the free-ranging deer on the outside. And then you have this zone down here where CWD is been picked up, what, in about 17, 18 deer now, Lou? 18 deer. So that's a lot more than the one you had a few years ago. Okay, so it's hard to know what the outcome will be. And I think to a large degree, what we've seen time and time again, that the outcome is less dependent on what Lou and the Minnesota DNR wants to do. It's more dependent on what you will support. You as stakeholders can change the outcome. The outcome truly rests in your hands. So I'm going to give you just a kind of a basic cookbook for disease management, not just wildlife disease management, but disease management in general. Could it be human disease? Could it be livestock disease? Prevention, prevention, prevention. Why do they think on NPR, when I listen in the morning, they talk about the efficacy of flu shots, and I hear commercials, have you had your flu shot? The best medicine for disease is to not get it. Right? So that makes sense with CWD. Your best medicine would have been to not get CWD, but apparently it didn't work. So if you do have disease in the population, be it human, livestock, or wildlife, it makes sense to not move it, right? So therein, you have carcass movement restrictions in the state of Minnesota. The whole idea, don't move disease around. Monitor for new outbreaks. I just mentioned in that map showed how the DNR is conducting outbreak surveillance around those game farms to detect, to see whether that disease did leak out from those facilities into the free-ranging deer on the outside. And then when you do find it, you continue doing that surveillance to try and gauge, to figure out what is the geographic extent, what is the magnitude of that problem, what's the prevalence. So that's exactly what they're doing down in this area right now. So we're following the cookbook pretty far, so far, right? Next one is where it kind of gets tough. Manage infection rates within affected areas. We saw what the Minnesota DNR did to manage infection rates with bovine tuberculosis. We saw what Michigan DNR is doing with bovine TB to manage infection rates. We saw differential outcomes. We saw what a few other areas are doing with CWD, and we saw differential outcomes. So this is one we're not really good at. And the tools we have are pretty crude at this point in time, and they're less than popular amongst some stakeholder groups. Well, that one goes without saying. If we don't have the answers today, we won't have them tomorrow or next year if we don't put money into research, into disease research. And finally, open, honest, complete, thorough information. And that's what we're trying to do. The whole idea of forums like this and getting information out there so that decisions and opinions can be formed based on factual information as opposed to rumor and innuendo. So that's it. That's disease management from whether it's Ebola in humans, avian influenza in briars, in poultry, or CWD or bovine tuberculosis in wild deer. Those are the steps. Of course, the devil's in the details, right? So that was the introduction. My name's Brian. How are y'all doing tonight? So yes, I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm at a facility called the National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, Wisconsin. We are the only federal facility that does nothing but wildlife health for the sake of wildlife. There's other entities out there that study wildlife health to determine its impacts on domestic livestock, things like that, but we're the only federal facility out there that really does it for wildlife's sake. Just a bit about me. I grew up just across the river, about 45 miles northeast of La Crosse, up in Monroe County. Grew up on a dairy farm. I've been enamored with deer, whether for good or bad, pretty much my whole life. So, grew up studying deer, hunting deer, went to college about deer, went to grad school about deer, worked for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department managing deer for 11 years, and I've been dealing with deer and diseases of deer for the federal government at the National Wildlife Health Center for the past 15 years. So I've been dealing with deer a little bit. That's enough of an introduction. So we're going to go through just a little primer on disease. I think it's good for everybody to have a little bit of background on what CWD is, and then we'll get into some hopefully more interesting stuff. And I have to note that tonight they have a really good projector, because sometimes you'll get a projector that whites out everything and you can't see some of these microscopic or microscope slides. This one works really well. So CWD, chronic wasting disease, and this family of diseases we refer to as TSEs, or transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. Pretty simple when you look in Webster's dictionary. Encephalopathy, a disease of the brain. Spongiform, resembling a sponge. Holes in the brain. And transmissible where neurons used to be. And in fact, these vacuoles are locations where neurons used to exist. So the cause, the disease-associated prion protein getting into the central nervous system, where it forms into these aggregates, and these aggregates are associated with neuronal death. And once an animal can only sustain so much neuronal death. Background to TSEs right there. There's a bunch of examples of TSEs out there. Several in humans. The most familiar one that folks may have heard of before is Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. Typical patient is in late 50s to late 60s in that age group. The hallmark of the sign is progressive neurological degeneration followed by death. Okay? These TSEs are uniformly fatal. Domestic animals, we see several other examples of TSEs. I'll only talk about a couple of them here. Scrapie in sheep has been recognized since 1720. And it's a close cousin of CWD in deer. They're very, very similar diseases. It's called scrapie because these animals develop, I guess we would refer to it as an insatiable itch. And they will literally rub the hides off their bodies when they get into the clinical phase of disease. So it's called scrapie. Another one you may be familiar with is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE. Many folks have heard of it as mad cow disease. And so that's a human event. We had a tremendous outbreak in Great Britain back in the 1980s, late 1980s, and it turns out that the result, or BSE, was caused by human intervention in the livestock production system. Turns out likely one cow developed a TSE at some point in time, and what we did to maximize production, we were using the offal, the parts of the cow that don't go into the human food chain. We were rendering that and grinding it up and feeding it back to cows as a high protein supplement. So you had one cow with this TSE, with this buildup of disease-associated prion protein in the brain, but we ground it up and fed it to thousands, transmitting infectious agent to those cows, turning cows into cannibals, right? So then those cows developed a TSE. When they died, we ground them up and we fed them to thousands more. So you can see how that escalated until it was determined that BSE was actually a foodborne disease. We didn't know how to manage it. As soon as we did know it was a foodborne disease, we stopped feeding cow to cow. And the epidemic's curve went down as fast as it went up the other side. That's BSE. Then the one we're going to focus on tonight is CWD. Like I said, very, very similar to scrapie, but just to give you an idea, there are other diseases out there in mammals that are very, very similar, and they have amazingly similar characteristics. Those are or include a very long incubation period. BSE in cattle is probably in the 5-year range. We don't in some of one of the human diseases, it's thought that the incubation period could extend upwards of 50 years, so a great portion of a lifetime. CWD incubation period, on average, is probably about 2 years. So about 2 years from the time a deer is infected to the time it becomes clinically ill and dies. Hallmark of all the TSCs, progressive neurological degeneration followed by death. Well, how could that be? Remember that animal was developing holes in its brain where neurons used to be? As the disease progresses, the brain activity goes down, and at some point the animal dies. So it's cause and effect. All of these TSCs are transmissible by one function or another. Confirmation is largely post-mortem. I have a star there because absolutely we can do live tests on deer. We can do live tests on sheep. It's just, at least with deer, it's rather challenging to get them to line up and donate a tissue biopsy. They just don't want to do it. So it's challenging. And the same thing even with the human TSCs. Absolute confirmation is done by testing brain tissue. And that's a pretty iffy proposition to collect a biopsy of brain tissue. So realistically, we confirm things post-mortem. At this point in time, there's no vaccinations. There's no vaccine, viable vaccine for any TSC. Now, there's a lot of people working on that, but they've been working on it for a very long period of time. And I don't think there's anything around the corner, so to speak, right now. Boy, would it be nice if we had a tool like a vaccine. It would be incredibly useful, but we don't have it at this point in time. So no treatments either. One thing that's very handy with these TSCs is they tend to stay within their own species, right? So there's this concept called a species barrier, which most of the TSCs do not go into another species. Scrapie, as I said, we've known about scrapie for 300 years now, and to date there's no evidence that scrapie has ever crossed the species barrier into humans. Now BSE, on the other hand, is like the black sheep in the family. BSE has gone into a number of things, including humans. In the instance of variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, BSE has also been detected in cats, both great cats and house cats in Great Britain. It's been detected in other zoo ungulates in Great Britain, and that's, guess why? We were feeding the high-protein feed that we made from the sick cows to other animals as well. So BSE seems to have some very unique characteristics about being able to cross the species barrier, but it's not very efficient at it. While it does it, it's not very efficient. CWD to date, we have no evidence that CWD has crossed the species barrier into humans. Doesn't mean it can't, doesn't mean it won't, but to date we have no evidence that it has. Anyway, and finally, the characteristics for TSCs in general, the apparent causative agent is this entity I've already referenced called a prion protein. So we'll talk about prions momentarily. And prion is an acronym for proteinaceous infectious particle. And Dr. Stan Posner came up with a hypothesis of this agent, the protein-only disease agent, as a causative agent of scrapie back in 1982. You'll notice he got a pretty incredible prize called a Nobel for his work 15 years later. So pretty sharp guy, and it's a very novel theory about disease. So we started out the night talking about tuberculosis as a bacterial disease. We talked about getting a flu shot to avoid a viral disease. Other diseases are caused by parasites. So we think of most disease-causing agents as being something alive, something that has nucleic acids, DNA, RNA. It's actually alive. Proteins are not alive. They're merely a string of amino acids. And the prion protein is a relatively short chain of amino acids, around 250 long. All mammals produce this normal form. So every one of us in this room has literally billions of prions, normal cellular prions in our bodies right now. They have a specific function that we don't know exactly what it is, but we do know that animals without it, that do not produce the normal cellular prion protein, tend not to live long and prosper, shall we say. So it has a function, and after the normal prion proteins are done with that function, they are broken down by proteases in the body, and the component amino acids are recycled and used again. And that's simple protein biology right there. So we also have this alternative form of the prion protein that we refer to as disease-associated. And this is the one that's associated with disease, and it has radically different characteristics than the normal one. So first, very important to note that all of the disease-associated prion protein starts as the normal cellular prion protein. There's a function that causes that normal cellular prion protein to unfold and refold in the shape of the disease-associated form. So it's a cascading interaction inside the body. I mentioned, or I'm not sure if I mentioned, the normal cellular prion protein has a half-life of some 4 to 6 hours. So it does what it does rather quickly, and then it's broken down and recycled. Disease-associated prion protein resists protease breakdown and is stable in the environment. You can cook it out of a deer if you get it up to about 800 to 1,000 degrees centigrade. Your steak's going to be a little overdone by that point in time. Also seems to be very resilient in the environment where we now, we've detected viable prion protein or it's caused disease in contaminated environments a minimum of a couple of years after the deer were taken off of a heavily infected paddock. In the case of scraping, we have a single instance where the infectious agent remained viable in the environment for at least 16 years. So that's a long period of time when you start thinking about managing deer, right? And another thing that's really interesting, with the whole idea of getting a flu shot is to stimulate, the beginning of an immune response, so that if you are challenged later on by a flu virus, an influenza virus that's very similar in structure to the one that was in the vaccine, your body already knows how to recognize it, and the fight against that infectious agent is facilitated. Because the disease-associated prion protein is the exact same string of amino acids, it does not stimulate an immune response. And that allows that really long incubation period to go on, because otherwise, if you had an infectious agent in your body for years, your body would tend to recognize it and fight it off. But they don't recognize, they don't fight off prion infections because it's not recognized as a foreign agent. Move on, so real brief here. Whole idea, you have normal cellular prion protein. Somehow an exogenous or an external disease-associated prion protein enters the system. They make physical contact. The disease-associated prion protein causes the normal one to unfold and refold in its exact image. So now where you had one, you have two, starting the cycle over again. So this is the typical pathogenesis, or how disease occurs in, at least some will call it with CWD. Typically oral uptake of the agent. So a deer ingests or inhales some disease-associated prion protein that came from another deer, or the environment where a deer had contaminated, had shed that prion protein out into the environment. So we have oral uptake, and we have passage through the gut lining. So a deer inhales, ingests it, and then it moves through, passes through the epithelial lining of the gut, typically around the small intestine. Then we see prion proteins start to multiply in the lymphatic system, in the lymph nodes. And if you've been in, had your deer sample, you'll know about getting the lymph nodes, the retropharyngeal lymph nodes extracted from that deer. That accumulation of disease-associated prion protein begins in the lymph nodes. Then we see transport through the peripheral nervous system up into the CNS, the central nervous system, and then we start seeing accumulation in the brain, and that's where the damage occurs. The only two places we really can see measurable accumulation of disease-associated prion protein is in the lymphatic system and in association with nerves. And there's quite an accumulation in the CNS, and that's why we tend to see it there. Now later on, during the course of disease, we see a retrograde migration of the prion proteins back out of the CNS, down through the peripheral nervous system, and that's where it could end up in things that you consume, right? So it's not necessarily in the meat, it's in the junction, likely in the junction where the nerve cells meet the muscle fibers. And this is a diagram, this was actually published in Nature back in a long time ago, 2006. And these prion proteins, these are nerve cells, and these are axons of nerve cells. And the prion proteins are stains. You can see they're actually mobile. They actually have the capability of moving up and down the axons of nerve cells. And remember, these guys are not alive, they're proteins. Pretty weird stuff, if you ask me, pretty incredible. So that's TSEs in general. Well, CWD being a TSE, guess what? It has the same characteristics, a lot of the same characteristics as the rest of the TSEs. So we'll just hop through these, because then it's going to get more interesting. This is the biology 101 that nobody wanted to come here tonight on a Saturday for. I apologize for that. So this is our TSE of North American deer, elk, and moose, and it's been picked up now in 25 states in captive and/or free-ranging populations. Guess what? Hallmark, progressive neurological degeneration followed by death. CWD is a death sentence. No deer survives CWD. No animal survives any TSE once it reaches the level of the CNS. Okay? Once it gets into the central nervous system, it is an absolute death sentence. Infectious agent, shedding bodily fluids. So these deer are producing this disease-associated prion protein, and they're shedding it over the course of the infection period through saliva, through urine, through feces, probably ocular exudates, and pretty much everything that comes out of a deer likely will have some concentration of disease-associated prion protein. And that's how the disease is spread from deer A to deer B. Remember I said with BSE, it was a human-induced disease. We fed cow to cow. We forced cows to be cannibals. CWD and scraping are very unique because they shed the infectious agent through bodily fluids, and that's how disease is transmitted. It's shed by an infected animal. A healthy, naive, susceptible animal picks up, ingests or inhales that infectious material, and that helps explain how disease moves from deer to deer to deer. Different potential mechanisms, direct context. That's if I have a cold and I sneeze directly on you, or that deer with TB sneezes on another deer. That you can almost visualize how that infectious agent could move from animal A to animal B, direct contact. Then indirect transmission. There's something mechanical involved. So the example here is I sneeze on my hand, I'm going to run to the restroom, and I put my hand on the doorknob, and I get infectious agent on the doorknob, and you have to go to the bathroom a couple minutes later. You touch that same doorknob, and then you eat a sandwich. So there's a mechanical fomite in between us. And with CWD and scraping, that mechanical fomite might hold that infectious agent for years or up to decades because that agent persists in the environment so long. We also now have evidence of true vertical transmission in a heavily affected area in elk. So this is transmission from mother to fawn, from cow to calf, prior to birth. So it adds another potential component there to the transmission mechanisms. Long incubation period, just like the rest of the TSEs. Now I mentioned your garden variety TSE is probably about 24 months. Very brief clinical phase at the end, so that animal acts perfectly healthy for 18, 20 months, 22 months, something like that, and then it gets sick, gets that visibly ill picture, that CWD positive deer that you've seen on the internet and in newspapers and everywhere else. Animals are infectious, so they're shedding infectious agent. So I mentioned that deer has an average incubation period of about 2 years. So it gets infected over here, and 2 years later before he gets clinical ill and die. Well, guess what? That animal is able to shed infectious agent, and able to transmit disease to other animals starting about here. So from a management standpoint in the wild, how do you deal with that? Okay, you can't tell. They look perfectly healthy. They're shedding infectious agent and capable of transmitting disease long before they develop clinical disease and die. Persistent in the environment, so we have these sex and age patterns of infection. So in general, older animals tend to have higher prevalence or higher proportion of animals positive than younger animals. That likely reflects just a longer period of exposure. They're living out there longer, so if CWD is in the area, over time, you're more likely to pick up CWD, simply as a function of your age. We also see sex-related patterns in most populations, where males tend to have higher prevalence or proportion positive than do females. Likely that's a function of behavior. It's not that bucks are more susceptible to CWD than does are. There's no difference there, so it's likely behavior patterns. We think about bucks hanging out in bachelor groups, early, late summer, and early fall, where there's a lot of mutual grooming activities, things like that. Then later on in the fall, they expand their home range and interact with a whole bunch of family groups of females, and those family groups of females come to being homebodies and staying in a localized geographic area. So those bucks are out there doing many more things that might expose them to infectious material at a higher rate. So those bucks are we would think of as disease sinks, and likely super shedders as well, super spreaders, because they're reaching out and interacting with so many other family groups during the fall. Tests post-mortem, just like the rest of them. No vaccinations, treatments, remediation tools available. No evidence of widespread genetic resistance at this point in time. That's something maybe we can talk about later if it's of interest to the group. But I would challenge someone to put together a list of characteristics for a disease in a free-ranging population of deer that would be any harder to manage. Okay? You just couldn't come up with one. And that's why it really is challenging. I mentioned, we haven't had great success because it's not easy. If they turned yellow when they got CWD or blue, it'd be great. It'd be easy to manage this disease. But this combination of characteristics really makes management challenging. As I mentioned, this is what a deer with CWD looks like. Right up until the end. Looks just like the rest of them out there, right? So how could you possibly know whether this deer has CWD but just by looking at it in the field? And she's not going to come up to you and donate a tissue biopsy voluntarily. So pretty hard to identify. Geographic dispersal. How does this thing move across the landscape? Two main factions. Deer to deer to deer. Remember, we've got that transmission mechanism, shedding, picking up infectious material. Deer A can give CWD to deer B, or deer B can give it to deer C at a later point in time. And that helps to explain that slow, diffusive process we see on the landscape. Then, if we intervene and we put infectious material in the back of the truck, we can move it pretty rapidly. And that could be game farm deer, for number one. Could be hunters. Taxidermy specimens, deer carcass materials, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what all these things have in common is that these are human assisted. So deer can move CWD, people can move CWD. Then we've got this category down at the bottom, wildlife assisted. I've got a question mark there because we know that if you put CWD in the front end of a crow, CWD comes out the back end about 4 hours later. But it doesn't mean it's going on in the field or to what degree it's going on in the field. So I don't want people to grasp at, aha, it's crows and coyotes that are the culprits. What we can do in a laboratory does not mean necessarily that that is a major function out in the real world. So these explain most of what's going on up there, I would argue. All right, so we've gone through the characteristics of TSCs, a little bit of other diseases, but why care, right? Cows haven't gotten CWD, people haven't gotten CWD that we know of. There's still quite a few deer out there, so why would we possibly care about CWD, right? And I hear that quite regularly, and I respect everyone's opinion, but I'd like you to come at me with data and science as opposed to rumor and innuendo, okay? I'll back up everybody's opinion as long as you come at it right, okay? Come at me strong. So a couple of authors, Mike Miller with the state of Colorado, has been studying CWD since, the 1970s. And John Fisher, who's going to be retired from the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study in Athens, Georgia. These guys are big hitters. heavy hitters in the wildlife disease world. So a couple of years ago, they put together a paper and boiled it down in the summary section into two big picture reasons why we might care about CWD. The first is it's hard on deer at the population level. When it's been out there a long period of time, it's pretty hard on deer at the population level. The second big picture reason is based on what we know about other TSCs, we cannot rule out that at some point it will become a human disease issue. So those are big picture reasons why we might care about CWD. Well, hard on deer. What's that have to do with the state of Minnesota? I don't know how many deer there are in the state of Minnesota. I think most of our states are on deer. If we say 1 million, half the audience will go, that's not high enough, and the other half will say the DNR doesn't know how to count. So I'll say we got 1 million deer in Minnesota. How far off am I?
We say 1 million, and you're right on both counts.
Yeah, so either it's way too high or it's way too low, so we'll do the average and we'll say there's 1 million deer. But I think what's more important is what you do with deer in the state of Minnesota. So Fish and Wildlife Service does a survey every 5 years, and they allow a survey to hunters nationwide, and they try and figure out what kind of value there is to wildlife. And so hunting, this is all hunting, so this is squirrel hunting, duck hunting, and deer hunting, but deer hunting typically in states like Minnesota is the lion's share. Now waterfowl hunting is probably right up there, but is deer hunting half the state, half the hunting, 2/3?
80% of our license sales are deer related.
Okay, so it's more than half, so it's a pretty big number. So, nearly 500,000 people hunt in the state of Minnesota, so how many, 400,000 deer hunt?
That's 500,000.
Okay, so Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't know how to count, or they count wrong.
No,
DNR counts wrong.
theirs is an estimate, it's pretty close.
Okay, it's good enough. Anyway, those hunters spend nearly 6 million days a year hunting. So your average person who's out there deer hunting spends at least 12 days out there. So it's a pretty big deal from a hunting heritage standpoint, from that point of view. Now, what about the economic input by hunters as a whole? $750,000 those hunters spend every year. So if the lion's share of that is deer hunting, there's a lot of restaurants, there's a lot of hotels, there's a lot of gas stations and affiliated businesses who would really hate to see deer and deer hunting go. So there's value to deer. In virtually every one of the states where there's deer, there's tremendous economic, there's tremendous social value to deer. So they're an important resource. Well, let's go back to that why care. We'll roll through this pretty quick. Geographic spread is an indication of what's going on with disease. In the year 2000, what we knew about CWD and its geographic extent was it was pretty restricted. It was that Western disease. I remember hearing about this early on and thinking, man, this is nothing. We don't need to worry about that. It's out west. And in a handful of game farms. Then in 2002, the unthinkable happened. We picked it up in the state of Wisconsin, actually the end of 2001. Well, that's 900 miles across the Mississippi River from where we knew it was just a year before. And some alarm bells went off. And then some funding was released out to the states to try and do surveillance to see if in fact it was anyplace else. So by 2004, we had a better picture of where disease might be on the landscape. Quite a bit different than 2002, but still pretty restricted, right? 8 years later, in 2012, the federal government started to stop giving money out to states to conduct surveillance through regular congressional appropriation. It ceased in fiscal year 2012. Quite a change in the geographic footprint. And all surveillance, in essence, all surveillance since 2012 has been paid for by the states. So look at current. 2012, current, 2012. It's a pretty dramatic change. And a pretty dramatic geographic footprint where CWD is established both in free-ranging herds and in about, I think it's 103 captive herds in Canada and right at 100 captive survey facilities or game farms in the lower 48 at this point in time. So a tremendous change in the geographic footprint of this disease. So if that didn't indicate spread, I'll roll through a set of slides in Wisconsin that I really think helps elucidate it. 2001, picked up these two positives, and I'm just going to roll it through. to where we know the distribution is today. If that didn't paint a picture of geographic spread, that slow diffusion, deer to deer to deer to deer to deer, I don't know what would. So it's a pretty incredible change in geographic footprint of that disease in a fairly short time frame. So it started down here, now going up the Wisconsin River. We've got pockets in northern Wisconsin. There's a couple that were picked up. Eau Claire County, that one shows up on the state of Minnesota's CWD distribution map now. That positive in western Eau Claire County, because it's pretty close to the river and a different geographic area from where you picked it up so far. Now, probably somebody in here is thinking it's not a change in geographic footprint, they're just looking harder. Well, the data suggests that we're not looking harder. Remember I said in fiscal year 2012, all the federal funding for surveillance went away? In Wisconsin in 2007 was when the Wisconsin legislature said, DNR, you're spending too much money on CWD, and they underwent a dramatic reduction in the amount of money available for surveillance and management of disease. And disease has done quite well since that point in time. It's done quite well. So the first one was geographic spread. How about prevalence, or the proportion of a herd that's positive? I'll take you out to Wyoming, and a mule deer herd that I've had the great pleasure of working with. And over the course of the last 20 years, or close to 20 years, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in surveillance, or in prevalence. The later years, there's a lot of noise, very small sample size. This year right here, they collected 4 samples and 3 of them were positive. So a lot of noise in the later years. But during that time frame, we've also seen a corresponding decline in population. So localized geographic area, increase in prevalence. Let's go back to Wisconsin. And these are charts from the Wisconsin DNR webpage. And so I've got 3 zones here. And we see an increasing prevalence. So I'm going to zoom in on one of them. And Doug Duren is here tonight. He's a landowner. He lives just outside of this 12 by 12 mile area. And so he's going to speak to you a little bit about his observations with regard to CWD. But look, we could barely find CWD in 2002 all the way up to 2009. And now we're up, this is adult males. So this is everybody 2.5 years and older. Their sample. The prevalence has gone up exponentially and is up in a coin flip area. Right, literally a coin flip. What's more interesting to me is what's going on with adult females. So they're up in the 1 out of 4, pushing 1 out of 3 positives in that area. So, and that's really, to me, where the rubber meets the road. Because your females are the ones producing future generations of deer. So if they get a TSE and they die before they otherwise would have, it limits their lifetime reproductive output. So their contributions to future generations of deer are curtailed. So if adult female prevalence hangs down in this area, probably not a big deal from a population sense. But now, you're starting to see some big numbers. The other thing phenomenon we see is not only are deer getting CWD at higher rates, they're getting it earlier in life. And the dashed lines represent yearling animals, 18 months old. I've taken a closer look at some of the data right in the area where Doug lives, and we see both phenomena. So over time, these are different time frames. So 4 to 5 year old deer, back in 2002 to 2005, prevalence was in the 2 to 3% range. Now it's coin flip there. It's 3.5. Change over time. 2.5-year-old males. Every third 2.5-year-old where Doug lives, or just south of where Doug lives, has CWD. And now, look at the yearlings. 1 out of 5 do. That's not sustainable. It's absolutely not sustainable from a population sense to have that high of disease penetrance that early in life. Same thing with a little bit lower levels is going on in females. I didn't have time to pull that data together for tonight, but it's the same phenomenon going on. Third characteristic, how about population impacts? We now have peer-reviewed science identifying population impacts in mule deer, white-tailed deer, and elk. Those are in the western states. Again, this is a study I was able to be involved with where we showed that CWD is causing population decline in mule deer in that geographic area called the South Converse unit. We measure a unit called lambda, and it's a It's an index of population performance. And so what we ended up with this study was showing that CWD is resulting in an annual population decline of 21% per year. If your IRA loses 21% per year, you're not going to have a very happy retirement, right? And so the same phenomenon, if you have a population decreasing at 21% per year, it's not going to be out there very long. So let's talk about that population performance, because I think it's really important. We have this idea of a stationary population, lambda 1.0. So the herd is just barely hanging on. Can't hunt that herd because it's just hanging on, right? Our white-tipped deer herds in the Midwest agricultural region, Terry's here from Iowa, boy, they grow a lot of deer food down there. We do in this part of Minnesota and over in Wisconsin as well. So we could probably see deer populations performing in the 1.4 range, maybe a little bit more than that, depending on where you are. So we see population growth of nearly 50% per year, and that's why you can shoot 30% of the herd every year. So this area between lambda 1.0 and wherever it is, where you are, that's our harvestable surplus. That's what we hunt, right? And so if lambda comes down here, we don't have a harvestable surplus anymore. If lambda gets down below 1.0, that's where we're actually seeing herds declining. So not only is there no harvestable surplus, but disease or some other factors actually pushing populations down. So the study we did in Wyoming showed that CWD was actually resulting in population decline. A similar study in whitetail deer in that same herd unit in Wyoming showed that CWD was causing population decline. Not quite as rapidly, but still causing decline. And in Rocky Mountain National Park, CWD was taking all of the surplus out of that population. So it was numerically stationary. No surplus animals. Nothing else could be added. Anything else would break the camel's back in your population sense. So that's out west. Those are mule deer, whitetail. It's harsh country, right? Lower populations, herd performance is lower. We live back here, close to Mississippi, where it's a mecca, where there's groceries everywhere. CWD can't possibly impact deer, can it? Back in this part of the world? That's an argument I regularly hear. So the state of Wisconsin DNR is doing a study very similar to what we have done in the state of Wyoming, where captured deer in the winter. It's great fun until you get kicked or hit by a head swinging. Take about 2-3 ribs out. We then anesthetize the animals, and then they do submit to a sample, a biopsy. We collect a tonsillar biopsy or a rectal biopsy, and we can test these animals for CWD. Then we put a radial collar back on them, just like there's some just south of here. There was a collar up on the cooler there a while ago, and let these animals go. So interesting difference. We captured these animals a year later, and the deer that did not have CWD, the date that they were captured, 3 out of 4 of them were alive a year later. That's basically what we'd anticipate. A lot of the mortality occurred during hunting season, right? So, but 3 out of 4 CWD negative deer were alive 1 year later. These are the positives. Only 1 out of 4 CWD positive deer were alive 1 year later. It's a death sentence. Not all of them died from CWD. Some of them died from probably getting hit by cars, getting hit by bullets, getting hit by arrows. But CWD changed their outcome. It was a death sentence. But even if that animal got killed by a predator or a car, was that progressive neurological degeneration predisposing that animal to getting hit by a car, by a bullet, by an arrow? We know that it works that way with predation out west. In our mule deer study, the highest source of mortality for our CWD positive mule deer was mountain lion predation. Mountain lions being ambush predators. They live up in a tree or on a cliff, and a deer walks below them, they ambush on top of the deer and kill it. So that deer walking around developing holes in its brain was less likely to recognize that there was a predator on the cliff or in the tree branch above it. So CWD does not always kill a deer, but it predisposes it to every other source of mortality out there on the landscape. In essence, shortening its lifespan. It's a death sentence, any way you look at it. So that's coming back, why we might care about CWD in the deer. What about human health? As mentioned up front, we can't rule it out. And that's where we're going to leave it. There's no known case, no epidemiological evidence, period, that suggests that CWD has crossed into a human host. But we can do scientific studies that shows that, at least in other animal models, it's possible. We can move CWD beyond the species barrier into a human model. So we'd have to conclude that it's not a zero risk. It's a small risk, but it's a positive risk. It's not a zero risk situation. And some of the science that's been done recently, they've concluded that that risk may be changing over time. So there's the risk picture for humans. Well, what do we do about it? The World Health Organization, which started dealing with BSE or mad cow disease, generalized their guidance with regard to all TSCs, saying none of it should enter the human or animal food chain, and we really shouldn't be feeding cows to cows. That's the World Health Organization recommendation. What about our Centers for Disease Control, our own CDC here in the United States? You can look this up on their website. These are quotes from them. So if you hunt in an area where CWD is known to exist, the CDC suggests that you strongly consider getting that deer or elk tested. And then the final bottom line for them is pretty straightforward. If it's positive, don't eat it. So those are the two reasons we started out with. Now, if you're Lou with the DNR, and Terry, you've got an additional reason. Hunters are your main tool to manage deer populations, and some of the social science and human dimensions research has indicated that there's another factor at play there. And it suggests that if prevalence gets up in those high ranges, 30, 40, 50% of the deer where you're going hunting, your behavior might change, or your family might change your behavior for you. So no, you're not going there. You're not hunting. And then it becomes a real challenge from a Natural Resource Agency perspective. So what are the likely outcomes of this situation? Here, look at my time here. Oh, I gotta get rolling, don't I? Get moving here. So, if we don't do anything different, what we've seen so far will likely continue. Geographic spread. Prevalence growing, population level impacts. Remember, population level impacts is not necessarily population decline. It starts with a reduction in the harvesting and surplus available, and then if it's out there longer, it likely results in population decline. So in localized areas, and it's an open question, you do not know whether this will spread to a more regional phenomenon at this point in time. Demographic impacts. There's a couple of ranches out west in Wyoming that manage these over-mature 6, 8-year-old mule deer. Guess what? There aren't any. If you see those high prevalences of CWD, especially at early ages, and it's a death sentence, by the time animals would have gotten into those 5, 6, 7-year-old age categories, there simply aren't any left. So not only do we see the herd level impacts, but if you're a hunter who's out there looking for one of these, and you get in an area where prevalence is high, and it's been high for a long period of time, the odds of an individual male getting into one of those age categories is greatly, greatly diminished. And hunters will alter their behavior. So, I'd hoped to have been here 10 minutes ago. Let's see if we can roll through this. We saw this before, right? These kind of key characteristics of disease management. So I'm going to break it down into two slightly different categories. Number one, and we talked about how disease can move, deer to deer to deer, or humans can move it. So these ought to be the anthropogenic risk, the human risk, the risk of humans moving infectious agent. If we can figure it out, we should be able to stop it from occurring, right? Deer farms. Plain and simple. We've got 100 of them in the United States, with some have now been depopulated. They move deer around. Okay? Some of those animals could be CWD positive. We've got at least one case proven interstate transport, and so it's a possibility. What's the risk? Well, fence-line contact, if you have sick deer on one side, healthy deer on the other side, or if animals escape from these facilities. So they constitute a risk. CWD in a deer pen constitutes a risk to the wild deer on the outside. It's not the only one, though. Okay? What about hunters? Moving carcasses. So these are the 4 counties, CWD Central in Wisconsin, right? And so we looked at where hunters who were successful and killed the deer in those 4 counties, where they lived, because that's where they took their deer home to, right? And it turns out they took them a lot of places, right? So that's hunters for 2 years who were successful in the CWD heart of Wisconsin. That's where they went home to. Now, that doesn't mean that all of these deer had CWD. Some of them did. And likely, a lot of these hunters took their deer to licensed processors who took appropriate care of the carcasses, and the risk was pretty much eliminated. The risk comes out if you're a guy like me who home butchers. So I take my deer home, I butcher it, now I've got a whole bunch of stuff, and what do I do with it? The ground's frozen, I'm not going to bury it. I go to the landfill, they don't take deer anymore. And so has anybody ever seen something that looks like that? Anybody hunt on public land? Nobody's ever seen a pile of carcasses out in the woods, have you? So therein lies the risk. If I take a deer that's CWD positive, I butchered, I got that carcass waste, and I do this, then I put infectious material out in the environment where a healthy, naive, susceptible animal might come across it. That's where the problem lies. We have people that move deer illegally. We also have this possibility of contamination of agricultural commodities. If you have a high prevalence of deer in a field, that are defecating, urinating, salivating out there, is there a possibility that some of this infectious material could be rolled up into large bales and then moved? I'd argue there likely is. Now, we have to have a B part of that. That bale or agricultural commodity has to end up out there where a healthy, naive, susceptible animal can interact with it. So is it possible? Yeah, we don't know to what extent, but I wouldn't take it off the palette of possibilities out there. And this is, I'm picking on Wisconsin here, because we're famous, natural resource agencies, for pointing at deer farmers and saying, don't move deer, but at the same time, we want them to store elk. So we move elk around and we release them out on the landscape. And I'm not suggesting that any of the elk that the Wisconsin DNR moved were actually CWD positive, but it's rather hypocritical, I would argue, for us to tell other people not to move them and then move them ourselves. So the elk in Wisconsin originated from Michigan a long time ago, and from Kentucky more recently, but where did Kentucky get their elk from? Oh, those places might have had a little CWD. So think about these, we talked about the risk. I identify these as low-hanging fruit. So if we're really interested in stopping moving infectious agent, stop moving deer, live and dead. Practice appropriate carcass management. Pretty simple stuff. The government needs to help us find appropriate places to put those carcasses. Stop artificially congregating deer. These are all simple. These are low-hanging fruit, folks. If we can't do these, we have no chance with disease. And look at these other potentially infectious materials. So that's the answer to that. What about the other part? Addressing CWD where it exists in deer populations, like here, over in Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, these other places. These are hard. These are not low-hanging fruit by any stretch of the imagination. This is challenging. Right? So the Western states have been dealing with CWD likely for longer than us, and they've watched CWD do what it does best, spread, grow, and cause population impact. They've decided largely they can't allow this to go on anymore. They recognize they're probably not going to get rid of disease in Colorado or Wyoming. However, there are opportunities for responsible management agencies to try and avoid potentially irreparable harm to those resources. Okay? They recognize they have to do something. They can't let it just keep rocking on. And they also recognize that a lot of programs have been tried, including places like the state of Wisconsin, that were curtailed very early before they had a chance to be successful. Remember Ernebuck? You guys heard about Ernebuck in Wisconsin, right? About as popular as shooting deer from a helicopter. So you have to shoot a doe in order to earn the opportunity to kill a buck. And everybody has a 180 buck on their stand on opening morning. And if they have to wait to shoot a doe, they lost the opportunity to kill that once in a lifetime buck. Anyway, I'm being facetious, but I've heard that before. So Wisconsin started out with tremendously long deer seasons and earn a buck. And then political, social pressure intervened, and they were forced to stop using those techniques. Now, the idea was to dramatically lower the deer population in the CWD positive core area, and if population was depressed far enough, you'd interrupt transmission dynamics and hopefully impact disease. So, the population in the core area was declining the first 3 years, and then it started rebounding, and it's up here now. Let's look at the regulations that were in effect. Long season earn a buck, long season earn a buck, long season earn a buck. No earn a buck. Shortened the season back to a traditional season length. What did the population do? It rebounded immediately because we stopped putting pressure on the population. And you know what? CWD seems to have leveraged that situation. It's doing quite nicely. It's doing quite nicely. So when people come to me and they say, Wisconsin failed miserably, well, no, I think the tools that they tried to implement looked like they may have had a chance, but they were socially unacceptable. Hunters said, we will not accept that type of management, and disease has flourished in that environment. It's absolutely flourished. So what are the Western states talking about? Artificial points of host concentration. Back here, we'd call it baiting and feeding, right? Out west, it's these big silos of grain that are leaking. So you work with the landowners, you try and mitigate that. Stop it from occurring. Stop baiting and feeding, right? Then harvest management. Increasing buck harvest. Bias harvest towards bucks, okay? And then the third one, harvest targeting disease foci. That's the Illinois law. Finding a hot spot, something that looks very recent on the landscape, and jumping on it, trying to extinguish that spark on the landscape. Let's come back to this increasing buck harvest. Remember I mentioned that male prevalence is in a CWD area is up here. Female prevalence is something lower. So if you want to impact prevalence and disease transmission, and the whole, you can't tell the positives from the negatives, which ones should you pick on? Makes sense. If you can shoot more of these positives, they'll have less chance of interacting and transmitting disease to the rest of the herd, right? So again, that's in big buck country, that'll be about as popular as lead balloons or aerial gunning, right? But it shows a chance. That's actually been published in a couple of different authors, a couple of different researchers who concluded that, at least in the models we put together, if you switched over to a completely male-biased harvest system, you could likely dramatically reduce CWD prevalence in a herd if you give it time. It's not going to work in 2 years. It's not going to work in 3 years. It's going to take decades of this to see CWD decline. So tools in the long run, there's a couple out there. Vaccines, like I said, that's the silver bullet that we just don't have yet. It'll take a lot of research before we have that silver bullet made available to it. There's also discussion of resistance, genetic resistance. And because I'm late on time right now, I'm going to leave it to my comment on that would be, I don't believe it's a cure-all. I don't believe it's a panacea. I don't believe it's at least a short-term solution to CWD on the landscape. But I think that while these tools are being developed, it makes every bit of sense to do what we can with CWD. Norway picked up CWD a couple of years ago in reindeer. They saw what we did on our side of the pond, and they took the gloves off. They treated it essentially like Minnesota DNR treated bovine tuberculosis. They decided to eliminate every reindeer in this herd unit, which is about 50 miles by 50 miles, and keep it fallow, keep reindeer off it for a long period of time. So you're saying now to yourself, but hold on, if they're shedding infectious agent into the environment, won't the environment be hot? They caught it early. Indications are they caught disease very, very early, so that environmental shedding, environmental contamination was likely very, very low. So they started out by allowing hunters a great shot at it. Hunters in this area took 1,100 reindeer last fall. Government came back in afterwards and they took 1,400. So there were about 2,500, maybe 2,400 reindeer in this herd unit. They took them all, every one. They found, I think, 21 positives, about that, so around 1% prevalence, suggesting that this was very early in the course of the disease epidemic. They're going to keep every reindeer off here for a minimum of 5 years, allow them to percolate back in, do heavy-duty testing around the area, and testing as the reindeer come back in. they have every chance of defeating this disease because they got on it early and they got on it hard. They didn't want CWD. They did not want to be the gateway of CWD into Europe, right? So they took the gloves off. So we kind of have these different types of approaches. Passive, we hear that. We heard that a lot in Wisconsin. Be more passive with CWD. It's not working all that well. Well, it's working well for CWD. It's not working well from a disease management standpoint, I would argue. We also have this, well, let's hope for the best. And vaccines will get out there and it'll take care of everything. Maybe. Then we have the possibility of active management, which is that population reduction efforts that we've seen kind of uniformly and are very unpopular. Hotspot coming, kind of unpopular, but certainly shows some promise. And the male-focused harvest strategy, published, and actually there's a couple areas in Colorado where they've been doing this for the last close to 10 years on a localized geographic area. It looks like it has promise. So there's your options out there. What does it take to look, what does success look like for CWD from the management standpoint? Find it early, implement strong precautionary measures to try and keep disease from moving, active, aggressive intervention potentially with some of these tools, intensive monitoring, open, honest, continuous dialogue with stakeholders, because if you lose stakeholder support, you lost the game. You lost the game. We saw that in Alberta, we saw that in Wisconsin. We lost stakeholder support, and CWD has responded quite nicely in response to that. So down to the individual level. People ask me what you can do. This is the last slide, I believe. I apologize. Learn about CWD, but learn it from factual information sources as opposed to not everything. I guess not everything you read on the internet is true, they tell me. One or two things might be false. So gather information, become conversant, take accurate information to deer camp, talk about CWD, but talk about it based on science and data. Work with government. Work with LU, work with Board of Animal Health. And if you don't like the way that they're dealing with CWD, elevate it. Because you got to realize that the DNR doesn't really make the rules on how deer are managed in the state of Minnesota. They're put inside a regulatory framework that's established by people that you have an opportunity to vote for in 3 weeks. So while it's a great fun to throw stones at the DNR at deer camp, it's one of the most ineffective mechanisms that I could possibly come up with, especially for disease management. If you want to impart change, you're going to have to aim high. Right? Promote surveillance, promote research, and if you are a deer hunter, keep hunting. I don't think there's a reason right now, especially where you are, there's no reason to quit hunting. Help keep populations low. That's a good thing. It's a good thing from a deer management standpoint to oak management standpoint. Keeping deer populations low. By all means, do not bait and feed. Manage carcasses appropriately. It's a big deal. And consider getting your deer tested. So those are kind of the take-home things you can actually do. Now we end up where we started. Where's Minnesota going to go? And I would argue it's up largely to the people in this room and others like you. You're the ones that are going to decide where the state of Minnesota goes, how you proceed, and ultimately where you end up with this disease. So, my apologies for going over time. I lost track of time. And I think we'll move on to others.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. We're going to hold questions until we take the stage here after Doug's presentation. So with that, Doug, you're up, and then we will give you a break right after this as well. So I realize this is pretty mind-blowing.
Don't watch.
Does that mean it's on? That is on. Even I can hear that. Thanks. So you heard from the smart farm kid from Wisconsin. Now you're going to hear from the not so smart farm kid from Wisconsin. It's interesting that Brian and I are similar in age. And he did grow up about, I don't know, 35 miles north of me. And we hadn't met each other until one day on my family's farm. A friend of mine, Steve Ranella, a podcast called the Meteor Podcast number 70. I would suggest if you want to follow up to this, that would be a good primer to talk about, sort of review everything we talked about here. And I met Bryan that day, and he was coming to learn about him, and found out that we had hairlines in common, facial hair in common, and our farm background. So what I was asked to come and speak about was my experience and my perspective as a landowner in northeast Richland County. You saw the prevalence in southeast Richland County. So really just less than 20 miles to the south of me is where the curves that you saw on that prevalence map, which we may refer to again later, come up. So our farm is in Westford Township, Richland County, Wisconsin. Northeastern Richland County. We were a part of the CWD management area. Aiming at the right thing, Doug. Oh, there you go. So this is our farm, Duren family farm. It's been in my family for 115 years. I happen to be the steward of this generation. You know what happens when you get to be older like me? You start saying stuff like, when I was a kid. And when I was a kid, this fields with the goldenrod in it all up through that valley were all farm fields. That's our dairy barn over there. Now that 4 generations have spent their lives working on this, farm doesn't owe us anything anymore. But for 4 generations, up until 1990, predominantly used for timber. My great-grandfather was a lumberman. My grandfather was a lumberman. Both had sawmills. And my grandfather bought the farm from my great-grandfather. My father bought it from my grandfather. And I have the good fortune, my brothers and sisters and I, that own this 400 acres. Didn't have to buy it. Incredible gift that we were given. It's 240 acres of woods, 100 acres tillable, 60 acres of pasture. There is not better deer country in the Midwest. When I was a kid, hunting wasn't something that we did, that we owned the farm for. And those of you who may have had farm experience maybe would think about it the same way. There's something we got to do and we got our work done. So at the end of the, talk too loud, is that what's doing? So at the end of the fall season, I remember September 15th, or that first Saturday around September 15th was just this great thing because we got a squirrel hunt. We weren't bow hunters. I recall my father, when bow hunting started, he said, well, he says, that seems to me like bow hunting seems like something for people that don't have enough to do. He was a gun hunter. He was an old school gun hunter. He used to go up north when I was a kid. There weren't many deer around us. Now in Richland County, we have an excess of 75 deer per square mile of habitat. And when I started hunting, we started gun hunting in that traditional 9-day season. We shot, if you saw a buck, you shot it. Heck, if you saw a buck and you were driving around, you went into town and told people about it. So in this arc of time of being about to turn 60, started hunting when I was 12. Started carrying a gun when I was 12. I was hunting before that with my dad. But so in this arc of time, I've gone from a place that didn't have very many deer to now it has in excess of 75 deer per square mile. Incredible success story. Incredible to me that the deer have been that well managed by our Department of Natural Resources. that we have that kind of success. So speaking of my dad, there he is, the guy on the left. We lost him a couple of years ago. He was an interesting guy. He was a big community guy. Not only did we have a farm, he was a rural mail carrier, he was the fire chief, he was on the school board for 35 years, he was an EMT, he was on the Lavelle Tel, I mean, he was on everything there was. He did so much stuff for the community. He was given an accommodation by the state senate as a 100-year volunteer that he had, over the course of his life, had done more than 100 years of combined service to his community. He blew past that. He was like 125 years combined service. The other thing about him was, when he talked to us about deer hunting when we were kids, and he'd go up north, he'd come back and tell us these stories about, you know, real deer hunting up there in the swamps up north, and how those guys went out together and they set up, you know, deer drives. They set up these pushes, all these little things, and they were hunting for the other guy. I remember when they would come back and bring their deer home, we'd all go over to a garage, and it was a big deal to get to go and be a part of this. And those guys were all, you know, deer that they hadn't butchered when they were up north. They butchered them together, they divided up all that meat, everybody got the same amount. The point was that I learned pretty early on that a part of this was hunting for the other guy. And so as we think about not only our time now, but our time in the future, I think it's important for us to be thinking about the other guy. Sorry about that feedback, I got a big old voice. About 25 years ago, I had a little brother who's no longer with us either. His name was Matt, and he was a bow hunter. Apparently, he didn't have enough to do. But we were no longer dairy farming in place. And he was living there on the farm and taking care of, we had beef cattle and doing some other things, but he was an electrician. And Matt had this saying that didn't matter what deer it was that he shot. Didn't matter. He'd look at it, oh man, that had been a nice buck next year. And so we really spent this time talking about that idea of deer management. And that let's maybe have a few more bucks like that. You know, that's a 4.5-year-old, 180 class, 16-point buck that I was fortunate enough to. Oh hell, I wasn't fortunate, folks. I figured that deer out, and I went out and killed him. But that's the kind of deer that we were killing. There's all kinds. I could tell you stories for hours about my brother and how he. Really encouraged that idea, but he was also, he shot deer. He didn't just shoot bucks. He shot lots of does and that sort of thing. So we had kind of a good thing started. Our nice buck next year was based on camaraderie. We had a great time hunting together, friends, family, and again, predominantly gun hunters. Really good ethics, you know, not a whole lot of that long-range popping away at them and stuff like that. We killed a lot of antlerless deer, and especially during the years that we had things like Hunter's Choice and then Ernebuck started and those sort of things. We killed a lot of antlerless deer, and we had a lot of venison, and my family and I really enjoyed venison. So, nice buck next year, kind of morphed into this thing where if you shot a buck that the group didn't think was quite up to snuff, he had to put on his hat. The fellow there on the right, who happened to hunt with us one year, came with Steve Rennell and hunted with Joe Rogan. One of the rules that we had was that if you're a new hunter, the rules really didn't apply. That you could go ahead and shoot whatever buck that you saw, whatever deer you want. Number one thing, good, ethical harvest. Well, Joe, being the good sport that he was, I think he just wanted to put that hat on. And he said, I think sombreros are cool, I'll put it on. Well, he also shot a 1.5-year-old buck. We filmed I guess 5 episodes of meat eater on our farm. We've killed 9 or 10 deer on camera, 5 bucks, and none of them has been older than a year and a half old buck. Point is, my nephews are on big tall, drink water, although Joe isn't that tall, quite honestly. But Sam, from the time he started hunting, really until the time he was in his early 20s, there weren't any rules on him. My other nephew the same way. Anyone who came to our place and was hunting with us the first time, or who hadn't experienced, doing a whole lot of hunting. So my point is, we allowed, that kind of thing. So it wasn't just for guys like Joe Rogan. So that was, really the basis of the whole thing. Good nature, good stuff, not sort of hardcore buck management. And again, having the kind of property that we had, or have, and the kind of habitat we have, it wasn't hard. We've killed 140-inch, 2.5-year-old bucks. I mean, that's kind of genetics and habitat and nutrition that we have. So, CWD in Southwest Wisconsin. As Bryan talked a little bit about, 2002, CWD was identified 70 miles south of Cazenovia and our farm, across the Wisconsin River. And I can remember it distinctly, because a lot of things started to change. One of the things that started to change is that we had these great expanded seasons and hunting opportunities. Earn a buck, which we actually embraced because we were sort of on the QDMA idea that, let's have a good, healthy population. Let's make sure that we're working on demographics and age structure. And there was this aggressive control in the CWD eradication zone, and we were in the management zone. So we had these additional opportunities for gun hunting. And again, remember that we were predominantly gun hunters. Still a fair amount of bow hunting goes on the farm, or archery, I guess we call it now. So we kind of embraced it. We embraced earn a buck. I remember the last couple of years of earn a buck, they give you these little stickers that you put on your license, for shooting a doe. And the last year we had like stacks of them pinned into the big bullet board that we had at the farmhouse. And we weren't afraid to shoot does. Population levels were something that we were concerned about, and Bryan alluded to it a little bit. Part of our management of our property is not for deer. It's not just for deer, I should say. It's for a balanced ecosystem, including heavily involved oak management. Remember back when I said that my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my father, my father not as much, but they were lumbermen. So this property was managed for timber harvest. I'm continuing that. The last 2 years, I had the good fortune, I guess. We saw the end result of 115 years of good management. We've been cutting 110 to 125-year-old red oaks because they're sort of at the end of their life, and what we're doing is starting that process all over again. When you think about that, thinking about the future and hunting for the other guy, I just think about my dad talking about what that was like when he was a kid. He died when he was 92 a couple of years ago. When somebody 92 years old said, when I was a kid, you're talking about a long time ago. Anyway, by 2008, CWD became really controversial. And I'll be perfectly honest with you folks, in 2002, 2003, 2005, if DNR or anybody else would have knocked on the door and said, hey, you know what? We got to kill all the deer on your farm in the immediate area, I'd have probably been, can I get a little more information here? I'm not saying that's a healthy distrust of science. That's just my attitude was, wait a minute. I like deer hunting. We like killing big bucks. We like doing this whole thing. What's in this for me? So anyway, what happened with us, this became controversial, but we still had these, we had some expanded seasons, and it became a political issue in 2010. In 2008, in 2010, in the new election, we have a new administration. still the current administration, and this new passive approach to CWD was taken on the recommendation of what they called an outside consultant who was brought in, said that we should take a passive approach. This deer czar was not from Wisconsin. He was not part of the Wisconsin DNR. So there was this group of us that kind of thought, well, maybe the river's going to provide us some protection, because CWD was on the other side of the river. And then very quickly, one showed up in Richland County. And it's continued to move north. CWD moved north into southeastern Richland County, which is now one of the highest prevalences in the state. We began testing in 2010. We tested only bucks. And the reason for that was the highest prevalence, as Bryan was showing you in the other thing, that bucks tend to be the ones with the highest prevalence. So DNR encouraged us to only get bucks tested. And that's what we would bring in. And remember, we were killing older bucks, generally 2.5, 3.5, 4.5-year-old bucks, the occasional 1.5 old, depending on who the person was who was hunting with us. But we were getting only bucks tested. Since 2016, we've begun to test all deer because they allowed us to. Every deer, and we are killing every deer that we have a good, safe, ethical shot at. We retired the sombrero and the whole NBNY management idea. Doesn't mean we're not still killing big bucks. Killed a 4.5-year-old buck last year, one high 150s class. He was not CWD positive. On the other hand, we did have 2 that were positive. And they were both 2.5-year-old bucks that we did. I'm guessing that you folks run some trail cameras. We run some trail cameras in our place. 2 bucks that we had not seen on our trail cameras earlier in that season. Really showed up about a month before the gun season. They were both killed during the gun season. And but bucks that we saw, about a month before the season. So those are our first 2 positives last year. And I'll tell you something. There they are. There's the 2 deer. Look at my hands over here. I'd carried gut and gloves. I've been doing all that stuff. We had killed so many deer, I ran out of gut and gloves. And I remember when I got that positive test back, the first thing I did was look at my hands. And I thought about things like my knives, all these things, all this stuff that I've learned about prions. Oh my God. The one on the left, it's a really cool buck. You can't see so much on the one on the right there, but they had very distinctive antlers. Obviously, the one on the left, that palmation. I mean, you can see that on a trail camera. You can know where that. You can recognize that here. One on the right, same too. He had split G2 on one side, little split in the brow tine. He was real easy to identify. We had pictures of him from all kinds of different angles. I can tell you this: if you don't have it, you don't want it. So cooperate and do what you can to help. Well, these are all friends of mine. Obviously, I'm there, but all really good friends of mine and guys I've hunted with for years. And they're on board with that cooperation. Look at those deer, perfectly healthy looking. No indication from either of them there was anything wrong with them. Unfortunately, I don't have this photo on here, but less than a month ago, my neighbor, the guy on the left actually, he owns a little 40 that we kind of surround, so we're his best friends in the world. He has one of those cameras out that sends you pictures, with to his cell phone. He sends this picture to me. He says, you might want to get out there and take a look at this when I now live in Casnovi, right near the farm. Mature doe, skinny, I mean, she just looks like CWD. I went out there, couldn't find the deer. We know right where the camera is, obviously. Went out there, couldn't find the deer, didn't go onto a neighbor's property looking for it. But when you go from seeing those beautiful, healthy deer to start seeing those show up in your camera, it's something that really does affect you. The other way it affects me is I don't look at deer the same now. It used to be when I'd see a buck, I'd go, see, kind of look him over and figure that out. Now I look at a deer, and I look at them to see if they show any signs of disease. I'm probably getting a little paranoid about that, but I'm also trying to, make those kind of identifications. I won't look at deer the same. Don't get me wrong. I still like looking at them. I dig looking at them. I enjoy hunting, all that sort of stuff. But I guess why I'm telling you that is I've sort of gone through a little bit of a process in this whole thing. Really, it's been less than a year since we had our first positive. I've gone through sort of a process of trying to understand the disease more, but also how it has affected me. And I think at the end of it, I'm remembering, those words of my dad about hunting for the other guy. So now what? What are our lessons learned? Well, I can tell you this, that there have been lessons learned in Wisconsin and in our state. And as a hunter in Wisconsin and someone who's particularly concerned about this, some of those lessons are what not to do. Take it seriously. Do what you can to help. Become educated, keep learning about CWD. Support reliable sources. I'm just repeating some of the things that Bryan said here. I kind of break it down a little bit differently. I kind of keep trying to reduce things down to smaller ideas. Buy time, pay for science. Well, how do we buy time? Well, do some of the kind of work that Bryan has talked about. Reduce populations, slow the spread, demand action. In our area, I've been talking with groups. I'm on the County Deer Advisory Committee for Richmond County, and I think it's a pretty good idea. It's got stakeholders involved. There's some concerns that I have about the idea of just the hunters and how much control we have over in some ways, how much control we have over management and then how little control we have over management at the same time. I've been talking a lot about it with folks. Fill your tags. County Deer Advisory Committee has given, with every weapon, you get one buck, you get a buck tag for any buck, and you get 4 antlerless tags. We give the most tags of any county. Southeastern Richmond County, as Bryan said, it's coin flip now as to whether an antlered buck has CWD or not. I can tell you about 3 different landowners who came to the CDAC meetings in Southeastern Richmond County. The biggest landowner owns over 600 acres. This group, they started buying that land 25 years ago for the express purpose of managing for whitetails and bigger whitetails. When I was a kid, nobody did that. Nobody bought land for hunting. Hunting was this extra thing. So these guys have been doing this. So it's really, it was really interesting talking to them. They shot 43 deer on that property last year. Which didn't seem like that many to me, quite honestly, in 600 acres. Every antlered buck tested positive for CWD. 2 other landowners talked to me about it. Wanted to manage for bigger bucks. Their trail cameras are showing does, fawns, 1.5 year, 2.5-year-old bucks. One guy said, starting 2 years ago, we used to kill big bucks. 4.5, 5.5-year-olds were not anymore. Third guy, we're finding them. We'll still find them, but they're finding them dead. Last week, Monday, our Southern Regional deer biologist came up to meet with me about some things that I'll talk about in a minute. He's from Dodgeville, his station's in Dodgeville, so he's driving up about 35 miles to see me. He got 6 calls on the way up for sick deer. Dispatched his crews to pick up a couple of them, and 2 of them were still alive, and one of them was a mature buck in a backyard, drinking out of a bird bath, laying under a tree. Gave the landowner permission to dispatch the deer. Take action, become a volunteer and cooperator. And I guess if there's one message I can give you tonight is, without dislocating my shoulder, patting myself on the back, that's kind of what I've started to do in this. Spend a little time with the folks at DNR, and funding's an issue. The state of Wisconsin CWD funding is less than $700,000 for this current fiscal year. Last year we tested 10,000 deer at a cost of, I think, about $80 a deer. Where I went to school, the nuns would be happy with it. I think that's $800,000. Now that money comes from different places, but you know, just testing is costing, you know, that amount of money. They don't have a whole lot of funding. So a couple of things that we're doing is adopt a kiosk. This is actually on our farm. This is a kiosk. We built 2 of these kiosks. I bought the materials, or our farm bought the materials, and a young man who has hunting permission to hunt on, now has permission to hunt on our farm, volunteered to build them. He's a carpenter. He built these things. We put one of them here. We put one in another area about 10 miles away. And his reward is to, he's was in a tree tonight, swinging back and forth in the wind, and we'll be out there again tomorrow morning. And so as a volunteer cooperator, a volunteer, what I'm doing is people drop off their, there's a whole little system that it's pretty straightforward. You kill a deer, you bring it over, generally smaller bucks or does is what we take in. You cut their head off, fill out some information, you tag it, bag it, you drop it into a thing in that kiosk, and later on I come and look at it, you know, I check every day and make sure, you know, see if there's any in there, and then I check to see if their paperwork's correct, and then call in if it needs to be or whatever. So we've been starting to have a few of those. But the other thing is that this adopt the dumpster, oh, I'm sorry, one more thing about the kiosks. There's over, last year there were somewhere in the mid-40s, 44, 45 of them in the state. This year there's over 100. Some of them are manned or checked by DNR, some of them are checked by volunteers, and then we also have cooperators in the state who are doing some of the lymph node extraction and playing a bigger role. But the point is that there's an opportunity there for more testing, and it is some way that, you know, folks like me and you can get involved. The other thing was this dumpster program, low-hanging fruit, hygiene, keep those carcasses off the landscape. That dumpster, that 15-yard dumpster, will hold plus or minus 200 carcasses. In Richland County, with a 10 or 15%, up to 20%, depending exactly where you are in the county, prevalence rate, if we've got 200 carcasses in there, the chances are that we have somewhere between 20 and 40 CWD positive carcasses in there that are no longer out on the landscape, spreading the prions. Prions being left on the landscape. So it's a hygiene thing, real simple. And then it ends up being in the bones end up going to a certified landfill, or a licensed landfill, I should say. This is, they make these really cool liners that go into the dumpsters that fit them perfectly, or you can go, and they cost $150, or you can go to the Fleet Farm and get one of these, same heavy mill plastic, 30 by 20, it cost me $25. And I talked to the people at Solid Waste DNR, and they said, perfect. That and a roll of duct tape, you know. Really proud of the township in which I live, Westford Township. I went to them and explained to our town board what this issue is, and if you think about this, it kind of makes sense. Who's responsible in a rural setting for garbage, trash removal? Generally the townships, a little bit the counties. So I went to them and said, we've got a trash problem, and that is these carcasses. They gave me half, and I said, our farm will pay half the cost of the dumpster if you'll pay the other half. And about $600 to have it dropped off, picked up, and disposed of. And they did that. Our county board thought it was a good idea. They referred it to the Land Conservation Committee, and the Conservation Committee decided not to fund one for the county. And they said the reason was, well, people are going to throw televisions and other stuff in there. So Yeah. So again, you know, maybe not the smartest farm boy in the room here, but I just put this sign on there. It says, please, deer bones only, you know, kind of low tack. Guess what? It's been out there for 2 weeks. All that's in there are deer carcasses. So, you know, people can follow directions. I had an experience today at a local restaurant. Guy walked in, the guy said, Duren, I want to talk to you. And I thought, oh no, this is going to be, let's just go outside right now, had a history with the family. And he actually came over and said, hey, I want to thank you for what you're doing out there. Can you tell me more about it? Could have knocked me over with a feather. So it was very encouraging. So here's some of the efforts in the state. The self-service kiosks, the dumpster, something that as you guys are ramping up here a little bit, might be something I'll talk about. At least in Wisconsin, the government just doesn't have any money for it. The governor had signed an emergency order that said you can't transport a deer carcass from one county, the county where you shot it, to the next. Ironically, I've actually shot a deer on our property that was laying half in Richland County and half in Sauk County. And I guess I would have really been confused as to what to do about that. But some common sense would have come involved. But you can't make that, couldn't make that transfer. There was a lot of concern about it, and ultimately the legislature stopped it. And really the mantra there was, it's not a transportation problem, it's a disposal problem. So the governor, you know, signed this order, but then he didn't put any funding along with it. So as ridiculous as this may sound, I'm having a bake sale to protect a $1.5 billion industry. Along with a company called Hunt to Eat, you know, figure that out. We started a little fundraising besides going to our township board, talking to some local groups and that sort of thing. But we literally made these t-shirts with this conservation mantra that, like I said, I just kind of keep breaking stuff down that I came up with one day in the woods, talking about our farm and our woods. And I said, well, it's not, I don't really look at this as mine. It's not, my siblings and mine, it's really not ours. It's just our turn. We're the 4th generation. So if we take that from our farm and expand it into a bigger conservation view, we put it on a t-shirt, and you get one of these shirts for a $50 donation through Hunt to Eat, and we had a limited run of them, and we've sold, we've raised almost $6,000 so far. By the time you take the cost of the shirts, and there's a bunch of dumpsters. So what we've done now with that is, with the dumpster idea, some people are coming, some other groups are coming forward, conservation groups, hunting groups, you know, the local you know, hunting clubs, those kind of things. Hey, we got some money for that. Great. If you'll give X amount of dollars, we'll give you, you know, we'll help you with that. But one of the things that we ask everybody to do, so the dumpster, the liner, actually you can't really see it very well, but right there is a bag of contractor bags. And I ask people to bag their carcass before they throw it into the dumpster. You know, early season, things are getting a little, you gotta be careful where you put these, because they, you know, carcasses begin to smell a little bit. This is actually on our farm. We happen to have a state highway going through, and I'm like, this is an obvious place for it. It wasn't like it was an obvious place. It wasn't like some great sacrifice on our part. So I'm monitoring it. There hasn't been a television in it yet. The other ones that we're putting out, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, which I know some of you are members of, is going to adopt one of them. They're paying half the cost. Our fundraising is going to pay half the cost, and BHA folks are going to monitor that. We're trying to put some on public land. Ideally, what we do is every place there's a kiosk, we'd have a dumpster. But with over 100 of them, I don't think we're going to end up with, you know, $60,000 through this effort. But I guess what some of that points out to me is I'm having a big sale to protect a $1.5 billion industry. It's hard for me to wrap my head around that. So, do what you can to help. Go back to some of these issues, some of these ideas. You know, low-hanging fruit, it's easy to pick. Those are the dumpsters, those are the kiosks. The kiosks are helping gather more information and data, and the dumpsters are keeping that infectious agent off of the landscape, or taking it off the landscape. That's really all I have to say. I'm happy to continue to sit here and talk about this as long as you'd all like. But I really appreciate the fact that you invited me up here to be part of it. I'm happy to take part of the day and come up here and spend time doing it. So, if you like, about the only social media I do is Instagram. Pictures worth 1,000 words. And if you'd like to follow me on Instagram, you'll get to follow this whole process as we go through it. Okay?
Thanks, Doug. Okay, we're gonna, as we get set up here on the stage to take your questions, this would be a good time if you need a couple-minute restroom break or just to stretch your legs. We want to end at 8 o'clock. We may go a little longer if we need to. So I'd say no longer than 5 minutes, and we'll go ahead and get started again. Thank you.
Hey, John. How are you?
Pretty good.
What do you think?
That's always interesting information.
Yeah,
Things are changing.
pretty scary.
Not for the better.
Pretty scary, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. Glad you can make it.
Oh, yeah.
How are your hunters doing?
They've killed some does so far, nothing but bucks. We've seen some nice bucks.
Seen some? Yeah. Early on or later? Straight through.
Yeah, I really don't have much for hunters up until right now.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I have a few scattered,
Yeah.
in September and early October.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now's when they start coming.
Right. Right. It was pretty hot early on.
Yeah.
You know, first week or two. Yeah.
Hot is meaning you've seen lots of deer.
Just a lot of deer, a lot of movement. Not bucks necessarily, but a lot of deer movement.
I've got some nice ones on camera.
Do you? Well, the busy time is coming. Yeah. We got a few Houston people here today.
Is there?
You know, these two and myself, and I see Cynthia's over there. And it's kind of good to see some locals showing up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think everybody's concerned about it.
Well, they better be. If they're not. Yeah. We'll see.
Every year I have, there are guys that carry carcasses from my area, back home to their state. So I know they're doing the opposite also.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to stop that.
Yeah. So what do you do with your carcasses?
Leave them lay out.
Coyote bait?
Yeah.
Same here. Yeah. Might have to rethink that, I guess.
Where else can you go?
I don't know. It's a good question. Yeah.
Can I take them to 603 and dispose from there?
Bury them, I suppose, but how many people bury stuff? You know, I mean, people come from all over. They're not going to bury stuff. I don't know. Actually, probably isn't the right thing to do, but we just leave them out for the dogs. The dogs eat them, carcasses, and, you know, bones and all. I mean, there's some they don't eat, but they're fat and happy over it. You know, so yeah, it's a real dilemma.
I heard a rumor they want to expand the CWD unit or whatever clear to the Mississippi. I don't know if that's true or not.
Good question. I have an idea. CWD will answer that question for us.
Oh yeah, it's coming.
It's coming. Yeah.
One-minute warning, you're gonna get started in about a minute.
See the guy in the black t-shirt there with the hat, cap? Him and a couple of these young guys have pretty much taken over Bluffland. And they're the guys they're really active, good, solid guys, a bunch of young guys. Sure. I haven't done nothing with this. You know, so, but these guys are passionate and young, and they're the future here. Sure. And there's a whole bunch of them too. Guy in the camel coat is our president now.
Okay, if everybody could please take their seats, and if I could have our panelists up front here. Before we get going here with our panelists, I want to thank the Bluffland Whitetails Association for holding this event this evening and many other things that you're doing as well. I should have mentioned during my introduction that Bluffland folks invited me down earlier this summer. We spent some time together. They've made now a couple of contributions to the National Deer Alliance, which we appreciate. I mentioned I was in Washington, D.C. earlier earlier in the week, and the contributions they make help pay for that. So they're not just focused on Minnesota, they're actually focused nationally on this issue. And I thought some of the things that Doug talked about is that this isn't just for him, and it's not just for us, it's for everybody. It's why we do this. So thank you again to the folks hosting it this evening. We appreciate that. So with that, there are a couple panelists here you haven't heard from yet this evening. I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves, and then we're going to go ahead and jump in right into the questions that we got from the audience, and then also some other hot button topics I've jotted down here to get the conversation going. So, Terry, we'll start with you.
My name's Terry Hainfield. I'm a wildlife biologist with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and reassigned as the CWD coordinator for Iowa. I grew up in western Iowa, shot my first deer in 1971, that aged me, with a recurve bow. So I've always long been a deer enthusiast, and obviously continue to deer hunt both with bow and early muzzleloader licenses. I think it's imperative that I first mention that every state, every wildlife agency has different parameters as far as what tools are available for us to use to manage chronic wasting disease, mostly politically and legislatively, and what authority different agencies have. Sometimes that helps, sometimes that hurts. So you'll find out that different states do things differently, and it might be just because of what's available. Things like carcass movements, baiting, feeding, lots of different things there. So recognize that from state to state. Sometimes that differences of how states are dealing with things is because of politicalness or authority. So some of the things for Iowa, we've got 28 positives so far. 25 of those are in Alameda County, in the southeast corner of Alameda County. The county below that is Clayton County, and has 2 positives. And we just found 1 positive at the end of last hunting seasons in south central Iowa and Wayne County. So obviously we're going to be doing lots of sampling in southern Iowa, along with collaboratively with Missouri, to test to find out what's going on in southern Iowa with that 1 positive. It's also really important that I mention how, when I said collaboratively with Missouri, how well the Midwest states work together as far as information, research, knowledge, and we meet regularly as far as what's going on in each state and compare notes, what's working, what doesn't, and continue to strive to improve on that. Some of the things that we implement for Iowa, I'll just rattle off a few here and then we'll answer some questions, is a lot of it's voluntary because of the lack of authority that the DNR has in Iowa for implementing some tools we'd like to. So voluntarily, those intra-state, inside our state carcass movements, we can't hunt over mineral or bait, but it's allowed as far as in front of a camera. And so that restriction of there, we're educating people as far as if you want the disease to move faster, put mineral on the ground, put feed on the ground if you want it to move faster. So we're voluntarily asking people to pull that off the land, and many people are saying, gosh, I really don't need to do that. If this helps, I'll do that. And then obviously other people are continuing to use that in front of cameras, or feeding in the winter, to feed deer. And also, one of the most important things we found, as other states have, is public meetings like this, information, and answering questions, and getting support by the public for what we do. And that buy-in, we've had tremendous cooperation, that voluntary cooperation from hunters submitting tissue samples for us and working with us to understand how they might be able to remove deer in those sections where we have those first positives to help slow them, stop the spread. I think I'll just pass the microphone off to Lou, and we'll handle some questions later.
So, I think most people know me. I'm Lou Cornicelli. I'm the Wildlife Research Manager for DNR. Prior to that, I ran the Big Game Program for about 10 years or so. Like Bryan, we have a shared past. We both worked on whitetail deer for our master's degrees, and have worked with big game for most of our adult lives. So I would agree with Bryan that when I got into wildlife ecology, I didn't think I'd be dealing with a chronic transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. I didn't know what one was 30 years ago. I won't repeat what Bryan said. What Terry said was really good. Minnesota actually has broad regulatory authority to manage wildlife diseases. We can ban recreational feeding. We already don't allow baiting. We can ban carcass exports, which we do. We can ban carcass imports, which we do. We can impose special seasons and mandatory testing. So we actually have probably some of the broadest authorities of any of the state wildlife agencies, certainly more than Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and the other states. As most of you know, we've taken a fairly aggressive stance on chronic wasting disease, just like we did with bovine TB, and Bryan did a nice job explaining that. When we found the disease in 2010 in Pine Island next to the Elk Run farm, we were very aggressive for 3 years. Whether we got the needle in the haystack or the disease hadn't become established, I think we did our due diligence with respect to harvesting deer and testing. When we found it in 2016 in Fillmore County, that was a little different. You know, we did the broad surveillance given the risk from Wisconsin, the risk lingering from Pine Island, the risk from Iowa, and then found the disease in Fillmore County. So we still think that we have that spark that people like to talk about. We think it's centered around Preston. We've got 18 positives confirmed, and if you look at our website, we had another presumptive positive yesterday in the exact same area as the last positive from this year. So we still think we're dealing with that localized foci, and are hoping that we can get on top of it. I think our big challenge, one, is dispelling a lot of the myths that are out there, stuff that's flat made up on social media, and also getting landowner acceptance to the long term, and trying to reduce densities and limit social interactions of deer in order to not allow a disease to become established and look like Wisconsin. We take a lot of heat for that. I think what folks need to recognize and understand, at least I hope, is that we manage populations for current and future generations, and we have an obligation to try and do what we can to not allow a disease to become established. That's a lot easier to do on public land. It's really difficult to do on private land, and I would ask landowners who are watching, listening, or thinking about it, look at where our positives are and work with us, work with Bluffland Whitetails, work with other groups and individuals to let us get access to those animals so we're not dealing with what Wisconsin's dealing with now, because we will. And I'll just kind of leave it at that.
All right, thank you. So whenever we get the questions here, guys, we'll just do kind of a rapid response to this question so we can get as many in as possible. And if you have a question, you didn't provide a card. If you have a question, we'll obviously take it if you raise your hand. If you want to address it to a particular person on the panel, we can do it that way as well. So just a couple quick things before we do that. These two gentlemen representing state wildlife agencies were talking about how they deal with the disease. I'll just share with you quickly that there's an organization, it's basically a combination of the states through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which brings all the states together to work on issues. They just released a best management practices document for CWD. It's over 100 pages long, so monumental effort for all the states to get together and talk with each other about how they manage the disease. That's a huge step, I think, in the right direction, so that we're doing things consistently, learning things from each other, which is important. And I also wanted to mention a couple things legislatively on the federal side. There are 3 bills out there right now that are sitting out in the federal docket to address CWD. 2 of them are very similar. So House Bill 4454 is called the CWD Management Act, and it was written by a couple legislators from Wisconsin, ironically, of course, kind of ground zero. But it's a $45 million bill with $10 million going toward research and the other 35 towards surveillance and monitoring, and that money would go to the states and to research entities. And the companion bill to that in the Senate is 2252, introduced by Senator Tester out of Montana. The minute they found CWD there, he immediately got active, which is a good thing, but that's a $60 million bill with $25 million going toward research in that one. So research is going to continue to be critical with this disease. And the one that's probably getting the most action right now is House Bill 6272. It was written by Ralph Abraham out of Louisiana. And this is an important bill because what it would do is fund research to tell us a lot more about the transmission of the disease. Bryan gave a great presentation, a lot of great technical information in that presentation, but there was still a lot more information that we need to know that could be presented in the future about how exactly it's transmitted. We saw slides of hay bales going to different states, and what does hunter movement of deer do, and what do crows do. There's just a whole lot we need to know, and we're hopeful that research there could help us learn a little bit more. So those are the three things going on the federal side. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into some of the questions. We'll start with the ones that were submitted. And this is a pretty easy. What is the turnaround time on a test?
So, in the last few years, it's been 7 to 10 days. A little bit longer in the height of the season, and if they haven't, in Wisconsin, and a little bit longer if there's a backlog. The company that supplies the testing materials, there was a hiccup last year with that, so it took a little bit longer. But 7 to 10 days. If you have a walk-in cooler, it's a great aging time.
Is that, I'm sorry, 7 to 10 days from the day it was shot, or from the day that the lab gets the sample?
7 to 10 days from the time it's submitted to the testing facility.
Okay.
So, like in the case of our drop-off kiosk, I got I found I was aware of the heads being in there. I took them to Blackbird, so they had them. And obviously it depends on how much, how many heads, or how many tests, or how many animals they have to test as well. But there can be a lag in there from the time of when it gets picked up to when it gets to the lab as well.
Thank you.
I can speak for Minnesota. We contract with Colorado State University, and during the deer season, we mail samples every day, and our contract is 3 business days if it's less than 350 samples, and 4 business days if it's more, which is about as fast as anybody can get. It's a screening ELISA, so the test doesn't take a ton of time to run, but lymph nodes have to be cleaned and cut and prepared. So there's a certain time period that it takes, but we turn ours around during the gun season, 2 to 3 at most 4 business days. So it's quicker than I think Iowa can do in a lot of the other states.
I guess I heard a challenge there. Last year we were kind of given an estimate of 1 to 2 weeks, and then the facility that provides the test kits to the labs fell short, and there weren't enough test kits in the United States at that time. And it hurt agencies, even though it was out of our control, that people were waiting for the test results to come back. Hopefully that'll be solved this year, and that won't be a problem. But Iowa, we're using Iowa State University and Colorado State University, and we're sending samples in now from our smaller collecting times of youth season, early muzzleloader, and when they go in at 7, 14, 20 samples at a time right now. We shipped them UPS to Iowa State University on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:30. They got there the next morning, and that evening we had some test results. Just a small handful of samples, but that's how quick it can be done unless you drop 400 or 500, at a time. And that's what Lou's referring to in those gun seasons when there's lots of samples going in. Obviously, that slows down some of the test results.
We also polled hunters through the National Deer Alliance in our newsletter. If you remember, you get that. You get a chance to answer surveys every Wednesday morning. And people felt that 24 hours, most of the people felt within 24 hours would be the reasonable amount of time to wait for a result. That's not to pick on these guys in the laboratories. That's just how we have to do it now. The holy grail is that someday we're able to be able to test our deer in the field and get some type of result. Science is not there yet for that, but that would be where we'd like to get to. I want to jump to this one because, not because I want to introduce controversy, but it's a question that I hear often out there, and that is a lot of people say, I'll put a slight spin on this, but people say, well, if CWD is such a problem, where are all the dead deer at? We don't see the dead deer. So the question was written, any deer found with CWD that have died outside of hunting season. I think what they're asking is, where are all the dead deer?
Sure, I can take a stab at that, and I think I largely did in the discussion, where CWD...
Talk louder.
Just on? Just hold it in my mouth while I'm speaking, in other words.
Delete the microphone.
So CWD being that kind of on average two-year death sentence, but many animals will die. Those CWD positive animals die of other sources of mortality. With any progressive neurological disorder, it's going to predispose you to other forms of death. So in our studies in heavy CWD positive areas, regularly seeing CWD positive animals. I spoke at Madison Area Technical College last week to a pre-veterinary or a veterinary technician course. The professor there lives in the core area, one farm north of where CWD was originally detected in Wisconsin. She said they harvested 9 deer on their farm last year. 7 of those 9 were positive. She said their driveway is a mile long. She says pretty much every month they see a deer that's really in poor physical condition, and then that deer disappears off the landscape. So you noted I didn't put a single picture of what we refer to as a droopy drooler in my slideshow because it gives the wrong image. People think they're going to see those animals out there on the landscape, and until you have high degree of penetrance, high prevalence, you're not likely to see those positives. Doesn't mean they're not out there, but most of them are going to die of something else, and those that die of clinical disease are removed from the landscape in very short order.
Yes, so just to reiterate what Monday, when our southern deer biologist was coming to visit me, he called and says, I have 6 sick deer reports that I need to follow up on before I get to you. As I said, we had one on trail camera. The other thing that I would say is, you know how fast deer will deteriorate once it's dead in the woods too, it will be eaten by scavengers and whatnot. So that happens pretty quickly. So we're seeing them.
Put it in perspective, Terry, you said how many positives you have altogether?
28.
Lou?
18 plus maybe 1.
Last year in Wisconsin had 600 test positive. Little order of magnitude difference, but it represents a disease that's been there on the landscape. And that's only in the southern part of the state by looking at about 5,000 deer, 600 positives without looking hard. In that area, in the heavily affected area of CWD, probably only between 1 out of 4 and 1 out of 6 gets tested. That means probably 4 out of 5 positives didn't get tested, got taken home without testing, and consumed by people. So it's not that there were only 600 positives killed last year. There were a lot more than that.
Of those 28 Iowa has as positive, all of them have been asymptomatic. They look like a healthy looking deer for all of those. We also do target animals that look sick. We want the public to report those sick animals. We've done a couple hundred of those in Iowa. All have come back other things besides CWD. And so that's one of the things to try to remember. And I do know, and I've seen the statistics from Wisconsin, they're keeping track of that as far as how many calls they're getting on sick deer and how many of those are turning up positive, and that's growing very much so in the last couple of years.
Thanks. One of the things that's really challenging for us to try to communicate about this disease is that question, frankly. And people say, well, isn't EHD more of a problem than CWD? When you have an EHD outbreak, you see it and you smell it. Because you could have literally hundreds of deer lying dead along a 1 mile stretch of stream somewhere. Okay, it's very easy to see and smell, right? That's not how it works with CWD. Therefore, it's very difficult for us to explain to people why CWD is the disease really to be concerned about. Not that we don't care about EHD, but it's totally 2 different animals. So let's go on to the next question here. You talked about this a little bit in your presentation. Any evidence of humans getting sick due to CWD in deer? The short answer to that is no. There are a couple of studies out there that have been done on macaque monkeys, and they are the animal closest to human beings that we're allowed to do research on, where one of the studies that was out of Canada, the monkeys that were fed CWD tainted meat did contract CWD, although that is not a officially published paper yet. Is that correct? So technically, it does not exist yet, even though there was some press around that. And then there was another study out of Montana, thank you, where they did not contract the disease. So the short answer is no, and I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that. Yeah, okay. So it's been adequately covered, I think. That being said, the CDC still says you get a deer with CWD, you should probably have it tested. And we would agree with that. This is a very specific question in a specific area. It says, has the deer farm in Fillmore County tested deer since it's fairly close to an outbreak? It says, deer farm in Fillmore County tested deer since it's fairly close to outbreak.
There's 20 odd deer/elk farms in Fillmore County. I don't have their testing records because they're regulated by the Board of Animal Health, so DNR doesn't necessarily see the testing records. I presume they are. It's mandatory, but I couldn't tell you what the compliance rate or the percentage. We'd certainly know if one of them was positive. You know, our closest server facility that was positive is in Winona County, not that far away, but reasonable distance. So I can't really answer the question because we don't see those results.
Brian, this is a question specifically to you. It says, why hasn't the USGS approved the live animal test?
Well, we don't approve tests. That would be a function of the United States Department of Agriculture. Any tests that are available for use are primarily for regulatory purposes within the captive cervid industry. So I'm not trying to pass the buck, per se there, but USDA is in charge of those regulatory mechanisms. And as with all disease testing, there's a great degree of importance placed on having uniform testing capabilities and predictable results. That way you don't have a laboratory out there that says, hey, I've got a great test for this, and finding positive animals and finding foot and mouth disease in livestock in west central Iowa. And the response, the economic consequences of that finding would be nothing short of earth-shattering or economically devastating. And then to find out a week later that, well, actually that was a false positive. We didn't really mean it. So there's real consequences to having, inaccurate test results. So for right now, there's a strong reliance on uniform testing through an entity or a set of entities called the National Animal Health Laboratory Network. It's conducted at state laboratories and followed up at National Veterinary Services Laboratory in Ames, Iowa. There's insistence on strict protocols and tests that are reliable and have been proven through time. So the gold standard is referred to as immunohistochemistry test. And there are no false negatives, but there are no false positive tests, but there is the strong possibility of false negative tests with IHC. But right now, that is the regulatory standard for testing in the captive side, and so that's used by states as well. Live testing, what was it specific there? Why hasn't it been approved? Actually, if one collects a tonsillar biopsy and conducts immunohistochemistry on it, it is approved. So it is using the gold standard. So it's not really quite an accurate, I can't give you quite a decent response there. But if you're doing immunohistochemistry testing on tonsil or tissues collected during an antemortem or live test, it is absolutely approved.
I'll add a little bit, if it's okay. So there's also, the sensitivity and specificity. So sensitivity is how sensitive is the test to diagnostic procedure. And the live animal test that's used is, besides tonsillar biopsies, they take a little piece of rectal mucosa, rectal tissue that tends to accumulate prions late, but it's only 70% sensitive. So in other words, 3 out of 10 positive deer or elk would show up as not detected on a rectal biopsy. The other problem with live animal testing is it has almost no utility in wild situations, right? We can't, in the captive world, sure, You can knock an animal out. You can take a rectal biopsy or take a tonsillar biopsy, and reverse the animal and check the results a couple days later. In a wild situation, we can't catch every deer on the landscape and test it for CWD and then release it. It has almost it has no practical utility in wild animal disease testing.
Quick question for Lou. Do we do the live test on the deer that are collared?
We haven't. The question was, are we live testing the deer that are collared? No. We're only catching we caught 100 deer in an area of low prevalence. We didn't want to stress them any more than we had to, so what it would have required was to anesthetize every deer, get somebody in there who knows how to take the rectal biopsy and then reverse them and let them go. The capture procedure is traumatic enough, and we opted not to do that. Now, if we end up in a situation where prevalence is increasing, or if the deer that end up in the harvest that are radio collared near tag test positive, because we are testing all those animals post-mortem, then we might change our line of thinking, but we just didn't want to put them down for 20 minutes in order to do a rectal biopsy when our prevalence is kind of isolated in that area of Preston and flyers with males. Did that answer your question, Jim?
Yes, thanks. Yep.
Okay, a bit of breaking news, we'll call it. There's, for the first time, breaking news. For the first time, there's been a CWD positive in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Okay, so that's big news. And also, as of today, I guess that article was, Mississippi now has a second positive. So, sometimes it's not really a joke. We make the joke that the state's only doesn't have a CWD positive until it does. Some people believe that it's everywhere and it just hasn't been found yet. So that may or may not be true. We're not sure. So we'll find out. Some new questions have come in. Thank you for that. Let's start with this one. And this is a good one. So how did Norway get CWD? Do they know where it came from?
Short answer is no. There's no real information in Norway where CWD came from at this point in time. Honestly, I doubt they will ever figure that out. There's a B part to that as well. When CWD was first detected in Wisconsin, I think we spent a good 3 years arguing and pointing fingers at each other as to where it came from. At the end of the day, it really didn't matter, did it?
Excellent point. Next question on that same card is: do western states still feed deer and elk during the winter, during winter weather or winter months? And yes, actually, we work pretty closely with the state director in Wyoming, for example, and they still do feeding there. And it's a challenge because now there's the science, and then there's the biological science, and then there's the social and political science. Okay. And unfortunately, we live in a time where the political and social science almost always will trump the biological science, which makes everybody's jobs up here much more difficult, by the way. So it's not as simple, unfortunately. We know that these big, massive feed sites in the West, where we're drawing in elk and mule deer in winter ranges and feeding them, is a surefire way to spread this disease. And other diseases. It's not just CWD, by the way. Brucellosis, yeah. So, but if we stopped it, that's also a surefire way probably for people to get fired and ridiculed and on social media and the whole 9 yards, because people feel like that if we don't feed the deer and the elk, that they're all going to starve to death and die. So it's a social and political issue as much as it is a biological issue, but the answer to that question is yes, that is still happening, even though we know better.
So yeah, the state of Wyoming has, I think it's 22 or 23 state-sponsored feed grounds for elk. They've been in existence for around 100 years now, for a very long period of time. And these were, good gestures put together, by the state to try and pull more elk through the winter, congregating massive numbers of them. Now, so a couple of things that have happened over time is some of these historically migratory populations have lost, their intimate knowledge of how to migrate, how to move back and forth. So these populations have become reliant on winter feeding. Another thing, now you're managing incredibly, probably a lot higher populations of So there's a great fear that if you stop feeding, they're going to go out onto the agricultural lands adjacent to those feed grounds and pretty much decimate, crops, ranch land in that area. So it's not only a matter of, well, what happens if you stop feeding? Well, they're not going to be pulled into those areas, but now what's going to happen with those huge populations of elk? They're going to move out into ranch land, cause all kinds of issues. So, yeah, social and political, it's absolutely clear from a biological perspective that this is inappropriate. And, the biologists, the disease folks in the western states recognize that fully, and their hands are tied, absolutely tied, because they've been doing it for 100 years. Hard to quit.
Thank you. And I'm going to combine these two questions because they're essentially the same, and it's basically wanting to know what's the proper way to dispose of a deer carcass.
Take that quite easily. So the inappropriate way is leaving it any place on the landscape where if there is infectious material, if that was a CWD positive animal, it's then available and bioavailable to healthy, naive, susceptible deer. And prion protein that might leach out of that carcass would then remain available in the environment for a protracted period of time, years, potentially decades. So you don't want it out on the landscape. So certainly there's tissue digesters that can absolutely break down infectious prion protein. They're not available and incredibly expensive. So the logical answer is take it out of where deer can get to it. That means put it underground at a landfill. So the thing that Doug is working on, putting dumpsters out there, creating opportunity for hunters like me who butcher my deer and don't have anything else to do with the carcass waste. I can dispose of it appropriately by getting it to him, and it ends up underground where a deer can no longer get to it.
So do you drag the whole deer and then gut it in your barn, or do you leave the gut pile out in the woods? That was my question. I want to know, Doug, do you gut your deer out in the field? Do you take them into your barn, hang them up, gut them there, put them in a big tub, dump the tub in your dumpster?
I gut them where they drop.
And then what do you do with the guts?
Just like I always have. Scavengers are going to clean that up probably where I hunt within 10, 12 hours. Now, okay, so I see where you're leading. That, you're leaving prion protein out there on the landscape if it's a CWD positive deer. Bear in mind, if that deer has had CWD for 6 months, it's been shedding infectious agent every time it urinates or defecates on the landscape for the past 3 months. If that deer is closer to clinical disease, that animal has been, in essence, dripping infectious material out into the environment for a protracted period of time. So, relatively speaking, the thoracic organs of an animal are going to have fairly low concentration of disease-associated prion protein. The highest concentrations in diseased animals occur in the lymphatic system and the central nervous system. So by getting the spinal column, the head, keeping them off the landscape, that's the highest utility you can have.
What's the biggest?
Certainly in a perfect world, yeah, I'd dig a hole. But if I kill a deer in the middle of December, it's going to be pretty hard to dig a hole out there. So I'm not going to debate you, sir.
Well, I don't want to debate. I think I should drag the guts home and get rid of them from home, but it's not happening. If I'm leaving that spleen out there, which is the biggest lymph organ in the body, there's the CWD. I just am trying to figure out a mechanism so it's easier for me to drag this deer back home and gut it and get rid of it. That's what I think should happen. I just don't know how to convince other people that should happen too.
I'll just jump in here. One of the suggestions we're always giving in Iowa is do the things that are most practical. There's a time when that doe's down in a valley, I can't get that doe up this steep hill, and they may have to gut it out. But if you can, and you got the ability, and you want to, most certainly, people are gutting deer at our dumpsters and putting that in there at times. Feed, mineral on the ground. Those are the things we have control over that we can do. So those are the sorts of things, are the decisions we need to make, and the most important things of the spread of this disease, and do the things that we can do to stop or slow that spread. Other things, people say, well, that mineral block, that's no different than a scrape out there. We're not going to stop the bucks from scraping. Do the things that we have.
You guys are talking about all these rules. What about our highway department?
Sure.
They drag them off the road every day.
I'll tell you one thing, at least in Iowa, what we're doing a lot of roadkill samples in our CWD zone area. Not so much interested in ones in the middle of the state where we don't have CWD, but what we do is we take the sample, we pull the deer down into the ditch, and then we GPS that location, get the test results, and need to know if we need to come back to that deer to be able to dispose of it properly.
And this is a good transition, actually, because this is a question for Doug. And the question is about working with your neighbors and what you do to get them to cooperate. But you did a great job of talking about overall broad collaboration. So, for example, that gentleman's comment about the highway department, that's part of it, right?
So yeah, the township board asked me, what about deer that get hit on the road? Because it's been a problem in Wisconsin. The town guy can pick them, put them in that dumpster. Anybody can put any deer in that dumpster. That's one of the things. And to answer your question, we've left, last year we started doing exactly that. We do have the ability to bring, throw it in the back of a truck or an ATV and bring it in and then gut it that way. And we started doing that at the end of the year last year. That's a tough one though, it really is. But I appreciate both of those questions.
Well, I guess I never thought about the aspect that that's been shedding prions for probably a couple of years, and it's already contaminated the soil, but now you've got this gut pile that's going to be another place for scavengers and whatever. I guess I never thought of them already shedding, and you're just finishing the process right there. I just for some reason think that needs to go.
Yeah, you think of that animal that dies out there, it's going to decompose, and there's some photographs in Miller's paper about environmental contamination showing a great flush of grass, green vegetation growing, literally right out of the carcass that's been decomposing on the landscape for a couple of years, and think about the consequences of that. So, but when we think about carcass and environmental contamination, certainly in that core area where Doug lives, environmental contamination obviously is probably going to allow disease to persist there for a very long period of time. But when I think about, like these carcass rules and the importance of getting it off the landscape, I'm a lot more concerned about a hunter that comes and hunts at Doug's place and then maybe goes home to northwestern Minnesota. If that hunter home butchers and dumps that carcass out on the back 40 in an area where, from all the evidence we have, there's no evidence of CWD, that's a huge risk. If Doug kills a deer on his farm and it has CWD and he leaves the carcass out there on the landscape, well, it's not the best, but CWD is already there. And the prevalence gets up to the level that it is just south of his farm, a little bit more, environmental contamination is probably, I don't want to say it's not important, but it's likely less important than the possibility of moving that disease to a geographic area where disease does not exist. So we have to think about it that way. So the precautionary measures, when I talked about them, things that we can do, those low-hanging fruit, to reduce the chances of humans moving disease to a brand new place where CWD does not exist, those are the low-hanging fruit. Where we're really challenged is doing things to combat disease, to really fight disease where it exists. That's the hard part. And I think of those carcass rules as the low-hanging fruit. They help reduce the chances of us moving it, because nobody wants to move CWD.
I'll follow up, Brian, real quickly. So let's just say we have 19 positives, or 19 doesn't confirm. We've had mandatory carcass export regulations since we found the disease. So we've had 16 positive deer since we implemented mandatory export restrictions. All 16 of those deer have been in the zone at the time the deer was positive. So we've yet, of the thousands of deer so far that have been killed since we've had mandatory surveillance, not a single one of our positives has been outside the zone. So our hunters are complying with the regulations that we have. I think if they weren't, one of those 16 deer would have shown up outside the zone. So I think generally hunters are complying with the regulations. A lot of carcasses and guts show up in our Preston dumpster, and we appreciate that. folks are dumping them there. Whenever DNR gets into our ever popular sharpshooting programs, we actually bring the deer whole back to our barn wherever we're working, and the deer are gutted right on site, and the guts are bagged and thrown into a dumpster. So whenever we can control the guts, we do that. We recognize though that we can't force people to drag deer out whole, gut them at a central location. The centralized location is the quartering shed that Blufflands has donated, and the dumpster that we provide in the refrigerated trailer that'll be there during the deer season. So we do the best we can to manage risk, but recognizing that we can't manage all risk.
And that's kind of what our reaction with the dumpsters was to this emergency rule where you couldn't transport it out of the county. So wait a minute, we have to have a place to get rid of these then, right? So they're not being transported out of the county. So that was why we started the Adopt a Dumpster program, so that was a part of it. And then the other part of it is, okay, we're already dirty, let's not make it dirtier. You know, so rather than leaving that out there, let's clean it as much as we can. It's hygiene.
I'll just mention one other thing there is, Brian, Lou, and I, we live and breathe CWD 24/7. We're thinking all the time. There's things that we don't always bring out to the public, and that's why we totally like that people come to meetings, ask these questions, because sometimes we can pass that information on. The one on DOT, you know, that we're GPSing the locations and things like that might be something that you hadn't thought of or didn't know that we were doing. Another one is rehabilitation of fawns. Almost every state has disallowed rehabilitation of fawns, of abandoned fawns that people have brought in, taken them multiple counties away to a rehabilitator to raise that fawn in a pen, to shed the prions there, and maybe release that fawn in a whole new county. Whoa. When we visited with the wildlife rehabilitators, they didn't understand all of the ramifications of this disease, and they said, you mean if we brought another fawn into that pen, they could pick up those prions, and they'd become infected, and then we'd release that out? They said they totally agreed then with understanding what this disease means as far as spreading. So there's a lot of behind-the-scenes things that we're looking at and studying.
I totally appreciate the concept of doing everything we can to keep all the infectious material we have control over off of the landscape. And at the same time, I think, we have to be cautious. Ernebuck in the state of Wisconsin was the best tool ever invented to dramatically reduce deer populations and have hunters do it for you. And it was so popular that it got dumped out of the toolbox. Okay? Effective? Yes. Popular? Completely unpopular. And the state of Wisconsin lost the authority to even use that tool anymore. It was taken out of the toolkit and dumped on the ground because it was so unpopular. I mentioned Alberta up front. They really figured out how to kill deer. It's the same way that Minnesota killed deer to fight bovine tuberculosis. It's called aerial sharpshooting. You can be incredibly effective. It was so wonderfully popular in Alberta that the ministry took it out of the toolbox. Says, no, people won't put up with that. So if we start talking about, saying you have to drag a whole deer out of the woods and take it to a centralized location to gut that deer, I think the DNR would likely, within a couple of years, lose authority to say something like that, or it's likely. So I think while this is a biological disease, there are clearly low-hanging fruit that are, from a biological perspective, are low-hanging fruit, but from a sociological and a political perspective, you may need a better ladder to get up and even talk about getting to those low-hanging fruit. They're higher than you think, and the consequences of grabbing those low-hanging fruit are higher. Without public support, we fail.
This is, I guess, a housekeeping type question. Someone has asked would there be a recorded version of this. This is actually being recorded right now on Facebook Live. It will be available on the Bluffland Whitetails Association page for as long as you leave it up there. And also there's a question about will the PowerPoint presentations be available. Now you can get them on there. I don't know if they're asking.
If folks want copies of the slide decks of that information, contact me.
Okay.
I'll give it in PDF format. The reason I don't typically
information will be available, I guess is our answer there. So if you're looking for something specific, let us know.
I've never seen any of my slides on anything.
Go figure.
Well, I'm gonna take that one of that 180 buck and like Photoshop my face in there. Yeah, and you'll see that one turn up again. Earn a buck's been brought up a couple times, and someone asked a question about that. I assume this is for you, Lou. It says, when are you gonna do earn a buck?
Probably as soon as we want to lose authority to manage deer in Minnesota. You know, we tested it at St. Croix State Park. It works. It's not incredibly popular. You know, there's two pieces to it. So if you think about chronic wasting disease as a density-dependent disease, you know, which is a disease that's predicated on the number of animals on the landscape, or a frequency-dependent disease, which is spread is predicated on how social groups interact. You know, the literature suggests it's mostly frequency dependent with some density interaction. So lowering densities is important, and we've been stressing that. And I get beaten up for not being able to say how many deer we're supposed to kill. But it's also killing adult males that we know are spreading the disease. If you look at our pattern of infection in the Preston area, all of the outlying deer, the two in Forestville State Park, the one up towards Chatfield, or Bucksnort, where the town is, have been males. All the deer in Preston have been males and females. We don't have a single female positive outside of the Preston area. So we need to kill both males and females. And earn a buck has the effect of lowering densities over the longer term, but it may not touch that buck component that we really need to harvest as well. So I think it would help, and I'm certainly not opposed to it. It has not been socially acceptable from our hunters in all the surveys that we've done, and you know, I did my dissertation on incorporating social considerations into managing deer populations. So we scoped antler point restrictions, we scoped earn a buck, we scoped antlerless only seasons, we scoped buck lotteries, and other than antler point restriction regulations, nothing else is really supported. Then we can force that on people, or the legislature could force it on us. But I'm reticent to go whole hog and double earn a buck or earn a buck until we have some social acceptance for that red. And we are going to be doing a CWD survey of deer hunters after this deer season, and I'll have 2 minutes at the end, hopefully, to talk about what I left on the table. But we're going to be looking at some of these more regulatory options as they relate to chronic wasting disease. But we're reticent to dive into regulations like that without some good science background, social science background.
So quickly, in our County Deer Advisory Committee meetings, which was attended by about this many people, there's been, it went from zero support 3 years ago to high support, earn a buck now, much higher support. The concept of everybody gets a buck tag and then earn a buck after that is one that's been brought up as well. So you're doing both the demographic and the population control. So that social component of it is kind of interesting in an area where, you know, CWD is becoming a problem. People are going, wait a minute. And the other thing that I will say, having worked on a number of state and a couple particular ones, state issues, a small group of very noisy people can make a difference, a huge difference. So if there is support, if you can gain support for earn a buck and support these people in the legislature, you can have success of keeping of supporting that kind of program.
So earn a buck is an incredible tool to lower deer density. One of the consequences of earn a buck is very similar to QDMA. You're going to have older males out there on the landscape, and as we saw, older males are more likely, at least because their disease is established, to be CWD positive. So there's implications of everything you do. So one of the limiting factors, at least in most of the Midwestern states, is you're limited to 1 buck. So how can we create a male-focused harvest system? You know, in Richland County where you are, you get 4 doe tickets with your license, but you only get 1 buck tag to use per license. So if we really were interested in attempting on an experimental basis, you know, a buck-focused harvest, and you can only shoot 1 per hunter.
Yeah, but then you run the risk of increasing population size.
Exactly. It's hard to figure out how to do it. But I tell you what, at least in Wisconsin, another CWD researcher that I happen to live very close to, we talk about this a lot, way too much. And so if we wanted, at least in some of the states, if we really wanted to try a male-focused harvest system to see whether it would have an impact in the longer term on prevalence rates out there, it's called, how about hunting the rut with rifles? With higher number of buck tags per hunter. I mean, seriously, you want to put the herd on bucks, hunt them with rifles in the peak of rut. And most of the Midwestern states, I don't think we have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, Missouri is probably the best example, and we get complaints all the time about stop the gun season during the rut. So
I never hear that.
can't imagine.
Since you brought it up.
No.
Okay, we're gonna zip through these here. We're a little bit past our time, but I want to get to a couple of these that are really important. Just a really short answer on this one. For larger samples and early detection, could feces be collected and tested for CWD?
At the current point in time, there's two assays. One called protein misfolding cyclic amplification (PMCA). Another one called RT-QUIC, which is quaking-induced conversion. These are highly sensitive experimental assays. We can do them in a laboratory. Very recently, Mike Samuel, professor emeritus from UW-Madison, was the first person to be able to publish evidence that he could detect using PMCA evidence of disease, of prion protein in environmental media. So it would be very helpful from a surveillance to learn more about disease by sampling environmental matrices, including fecal material. We can do it in a laboratory sense, but it's very, very challenging at this point in time. Over time, I think we'll get there, but we're not there yet.
And I agree with Brian. I mean, oftentimes you read, why isn't DNR doing Western blot, or why isn't DNR doing RT-QUIC? And there's a confusion between, basic science that's still emerging and applied science that we can use in management. And I think Brian's right. In 10 years, there may be a swab that you stick into a water hole and it's, positive or not, but it's not there yet. It's all laboratory testing. So, we use the tools that we have available for diagnostic purposes, and we can't use tools that aren't verified, right? Because like Brian had mentioned, if we, again, somebody comes out with a swab and it turns out it's not right, then we get criticized for not using certified testing. So we have very strict protocols on how we do our testing, and we stick to that because it's the responsible thing to do.
So the dumb farm kit says, buy time, pay for science. For that stuff to develop.
Right, and right now, at least with Minnesota DNR, the vast majority, all of the surveillance right now comes in the backs of people who buy hunting and fishing licenses. And we're doing surveillance around captive service facilities. Deer hunters are paying for it. We get no money from the general fund. So if you want to lobby somebody, lobby the legislature to get general fund revenue to pay for our surveillance and our research projects.
Beginning, I think, in fiscal year 2003 or 2004, federal Congress, United States Congress appropriated funding for research and surveillance in both the captive side and the free-ranging side. And so that was an annual appropriation that varied someplace between maybe 13 and 14 and 17, $18 million per year that was portioned out to the states for use equally on the captive and the free-ranging side. That federal appropriation was discontinued in fiscal year 2012, eliminated. So there currently is essentially no federal funding coming out to the states to support surveillance and CWD management. But there's two bills in front of Congress that...
Yeah, and that's why we're banging on the doors of Congress now to try to get some of that. Frankly, they just got bored of it. Simple as that. And we didn't keep pressing the issue, so we're back. So Terry, this one's specific to you, and then I'm going to end on one that I think is a pretty hot button issue that I hear coming up across the country. So I'll give you this isn't easy either, but I'll throw this one to you. It says specifically for Terry, Iowa, concerns about the CWD outbreak in Fillmore County and your action plan.
Sure, like I mentioned, we're working collaboratively, so we're sharing information as far as Minnesota's positives, their movements, their studies, and what we're doing. Of course, we're concerned about that, but we don't have political boundaries of Iowa and Minnesota when we think biologically. So we're working together as far as to how we would best manage our disease with our tools, like I mentioned. With that, we've got 3 meetings set up this coming week, just south of where those positives are and where some of the radio collar deer are crossing over into Iowa. People are seeing the collars and starting thinking, those are probably CWD positive deer in Iowa. So we have 2 meetings in Cresco next Tuesday and 1 in Decorah, start prepping the people and getting more samples done and testing, deer in that region. We've already ramped it up in the last few years, but we want even more samples in that area. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Before I get into this last one, just say that we will give Lou your 2 minutes at the end to talk about the things that you brought there. And also, after we address this one, we'll be shutting these mics off, but we'll still be here if you want to just do some one-on-ones. We wrap up, even I think they kick us out at 9 o'clock, I think is our deadline, our drop dead deadline. So this is an interesting one, and I hear this brought up across the country, and we have polled on this a couple of different ways through the National Deer Alliance, and that is this issue of deer being processed at commercial processors. And assuming that we know that not all deer are tested for CWD, therefore we can assume that there are some deer that have CWD that are being processed by commercial processors side by side with the deer that maybe you have taken in, and in some cases maybe even commingled, depending on how that processor makes things like sausage and other things. The question is, isn't there contamination in that situation, and should we be concerned? I will give my short answer, and I let the panelists take it from there, but yes, we should be concerned for a number of reasons. Number one, the contamination, number one, but number two, also, we have polled people and asked them, your ability to take a deer to a commercial processor, if that was taken away from you, would that lead you to potentially decide, you know what, I'm going to quit hunting? Because it's just too much hassle. I don't know how to, I don't have the facility to process my own. And a scary high percentage of people said yes to that question. And when you think about it, it was brought up earlier that, well, it wasn't said exactly this way, but about 80% of all hunters hunt deer or big game, out of all licensed buyers across the country. And when you think about where the money comes from to manage all wildlife, not just the things we shoot at, not just game species, 80% of the people are spending money on a license because they're going to hunt big game or deer. We start cutting into that 80%, and we're not just talking about license sales, also Pittman Robertson excise tax dollars, largely purchased by people who hunt big game. Now all of a sudden we're talking about less money to manage things like songbirds and other things that people like to see. So this is CWD is not just a deer disease. I can promise you that. It's much bigger than that. So this doesn't just affect people here who like to hunt deer, interested in deer. It affects everybody. And this issue of deer being butchered, and we don't know which ones have, we don't know how many people have, you may have eaten 5 or 6 CWD deer, you don't even know it. That's another issue. But that's an impact on the broader sport of deer hunting. It's an impact on the economy. How concerned should we be about this? No one's reaching for the mic.
I think it depends on where you are, right? I'll speak for myself. I have long processed my own deer, long before there were CWD issues. I'm meticulous about how I handle the meat. I shoot copper ammo. I don't really feel like eating someone else's listeria or E. coli or deer hair or leg. So I have long processed my own venison for reasons other than CWD. There are processors in Wisconsin, at least one, that just quit doing deer for some of those reasons. You know, it's all about risk, but some of it's just simple foodborne risk, because you don't know if the venison's mixed, you don't know what you're getting, right? And they all mix sausage. They have to. There's no way to do batches of sausage without mixing. A lot don't mix on the ground, but some do. So it's all risk. Would I take a deer in Wisconsin to a processor? No, I wouldn't. Not with their prevalence rates. Would I in International Falls? Maybe. We don't have any risk factors up there that we're aware of. So it kind of depends on your risk tolerance, your risk perceptions, and what's around you. I realize that might be an evasive answer, but there isn't a binary yes or no answer.
Boy, he nailed that. I was going to say there's 3 factors involved. 1, where you hunt. 2, how much you know about the risks associated. And 3, your personal tolerance for risk. That's the answer to that question.
So, one of the lockers in our area is also they take deer donations, and they're paid for through the deer donation program. And so what's done there is you have to, before you can donate a deer, you have to have it tested for CWD. Then they isolate that deer that's got the tag. They debone and then bag the meat until they find out. And then if they find out that it's positive, then they discard it. And in fact, the one deer that we had that was positive, that's exactly what happened to it. And I don't want that deer donation program to go away either. So that is really complicated. I do know that there's one processor in Wisconsin who posted on his website and social media that if you get your deer tested for CWD, do not bring it to me to process it. Think about that for a while.
You know why that is?
Because you have to throw out the whole batch.
No, Food Safety Inspection Service has already issued rules that says that if your animal is tested for CWD, whether it's farm or anything, you have to wait till the tests come back, show CWD negative results before they can release the product. So, you're worried about it. It's already out there. And now the question is, do you want to wait for your CWD to come back and get your product back from your processor, or do you skip testing and take it and go? I mean, there's rates out there already that say if you test it, that processor has to wait.
And then whether you get it back or not whether they go ahead and debone it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's actually the case with the one plant that I'm aware of that does the donation.
Right.
If you can also have your deer tested and let them know.
Yeah.
And then when you find out, then they hold on.
But the question comes down, you have to let them know if that's going to be tested.
Yeah, so it's really, but I can understand that the batching is the other problem.
Yeah.
For the other person.
So, back in the early days of CWD in Wisconsin, we found out that rendering companies that were working with processors, at least one rendering company, and that's how the processors were getting rid of all that extra stuff. That a rendering company decided that they would not accept any waste from your butcher shop if a deer had been tested for CWD. Okay, think about that now. They did not want anything that was tested. So in other words, they had no concerns over whether there was potential contamination from CWD in the material that they were buying. They were only concerned about the risk, because if one deer came back positive, they would have to throw out that whole batch. And so it was a purely economic consideration. That they didn't care whether there was CWD in their material. They only cared if they found out.
Okay, I want to thank all of you who took the time to come out here this evening. I can tell you that those of us who work in this, 100% of the time, if we are asked to do these things and our schedule is available, we will do it, because you take the time to come out here and learn more and want to learn more about it. So we appreciate you very much for coming out and being interested. We're hopeful that you pass this along, or if you're watching this online on Facebook Live, even if you're watching it after it's no longer live, that you pass this on to your friends as well. I'd also ask for a round of applause for the Bluffland Whitetails Association. You guys are the ones that asked for this and put it together, and you really are leading the way in a lot of ways on this issue, and we appreciate you very, very much. And then finally, just for our great panelists up here, you guys are really lucky to be able to hear from these folks. These are really top dogs on this issue, folks, and we're lucky to listen to them. And Lou gets his 2 minutes, so don't run out the door.
Yeah, all right, hold on. So a couple things. One, I've had a long relationship with Bluffland Whitetails, and I want to commend them for their leadership on this issue. I really do. I hope that the other groups that are in the audience or watching online, you know, kind of get in with that. They've really taken a leadership issue. You know, I troll social media a little bit, and they're getting beaten up by some captive servant owners, and they're staying above the fray, and they're doing a nice job, and I commend them for the shed, and for what they're trying to do to not let this disease persist. One thing, we're doing a survey at the end of deer season, a random sample of Zone 3 hunters, pretty much are at population management and chronic wasting disease. And what Todd Froberg is handing out is what's called an elicitation survey. We're trying, as we pull our survey together, we want people to think about what's on the top of your mind. So there's three simple questions. If you could take just a minute and answer those, your answers help inform our survey. So if you can say you hate me, but that won't be on the survey, that's a constant, I know that. But it'll help inform a piece of our survey. And also, Todd Froberg, the good-looking guy with the hat, is our landowner assistance specialist. We created a position to have someone work directly with hunters and landowners and non-hunters on population management and disease management. So if you haven't gotten to know Todd, please do that. He's going to be the person on the ground helping us get through these issues. So that's all I had to say. And just fill that out and hand it back to Todd or I before you go. Thanks a ton.
And I'm going to give Iowa a plug there. The Whitetails Unlimited and Iowa Bow Hunting Association also are very strong supporters of what we're doing in Iowa too.
That's it. So if you want to grab us on the way out, we'll be happy to chat with you then. Thank you again for coming. Drive home safe.
And we reiterate, thanks for coming out. We really do.
Hey, Todd.